If Jesus had a child, if the Holy Grail were not a cup but a living bloodline, sheltered by kings, guarded by knights, pursued by a church afraid of what it might mean, then what, exactly, was erased from history? Follow that thought like a candle carried down a long corridor, and it reaches the Merovingians, the long-haired kings who hinted at sacred blood and ruled as if hair itself were an oath. At the center stands a quiet rupture, the year 679, a royal hunt that does not end, and King Dagobert II slipping out of the chronicles as if a page had been turned and never written on again. We will not argue. We will drift. Forest light on the Arden path, the cool line of a Roman road, and the hush you hear when the annals blink. This is where the story chooses its pace. Between the gaps, symbols hum. Bees, lilies, uncut hair. Between the borders, rumors travel. A missing tomb near Paris, a country shrine that would not forget, papers that arrived centuries late and behaved like proof. Welcome to Serene Myths. If slow, calming history helps you rest, you're warmly invited to follow along. Feel free to like and subscribe if you wish. And leave a quiet comment with where and when you're listening. It's comforting to imagine our scattered rooms linked by one wandering thread. Now breathe with the trees. The wind gathers, the road narrows, and a bell seems about to ring, then doesn't. Step with us onto the Arden track, toward a blue cloak and an absence that teaches how to listen. The wind threads through the trees like a quiet choir, each branch holding a different note, all of them soft. The Roman road lies ahead, a pale ribbon pressed into the green, damp with the day's last light. Hoofprints pock the margin where moss gives way to rutted clay, and a thin scatter of leaves moves as if something just passed. Somewhere far off, a bell rings once, and then loses courage. We follow the sound that remains, the hush of a forest listening. The season is neither fully autumn nor still summer, the kind of evening when the air tastes of iron and apples. Underfoot, the stones remember sandals and carts, the old empire passing like weather through a land that keeps its shape. Dogs nose the weeds and return to heel. A cloak lifts, falls, lifts again, blue, like a quiet lake. The path narrows in its own good time, and the trees lean together in a council of shadows. Here, on this subdued road, history offers a single detail, clear as the notch in a bone. A king does not return from a hunt. His name is Dagobert, second of that name to rule in Austrasia, and the year is 679. The sources that survive agree on the outcome, if not the weather, the names of the birds, or the place where the saddle creaked. The fact stands like a mile marker. Everything before and after feels strangely less solid. Around that marker, the forest swells with stories that press close, but never quite touch the stone. Some say the blow came to the eye. Some say to the temple. All agree that it was quick, like a door closing against a song. A hunter's dog found him and did not bark. The animal lay down, and in the silence, its breath became a little cloud in the cool air. A bright strip of cloth snagged on bramble, the color of royal blue. The details drift like thistledown, yet refuse to vanish. They cling to the edges of the path the way mist clings to a river at dawn. What to make of the hand that closed the door? In whispers that thicken over centuries, names gather like rain. A rival at court with a careful smile, a steward whose power had outgrown his chair, a bishop who could not bless what his theology could not contain. The forest does not point. It only holds the silence. Even in gentlest consideration, one senses that a line had to be drawn somewhere, and that a body, once lifeless, draws the firmest lines. He belonged to the long-haired kings, and the hair matters. It was not fashion, but a fabric of meaning, a veil over a crown within the skull. In that world, to cut a king's hair was to blunt something invisible and potent. To see it falling was to watch legitimacy drift to the floor. Dagobert carried that uncut sign down this road, a moving relic of sovereignty carried on a man of muscle and breath. Now the breeze goes on with the gesture the shears would have made, combing the grass with cool fingers until the meadow lies flat. Listen closely, and the road has a second voice beneath the murmur of leaves. The stones remember iron tips and waxed cords, a retinue that spoke sparingly because the work of kingship was heavy as wet wool. Even the birds seem to lower their songs to match the mood. The shape of the root is Roman, but the weight upon it is Frankish, and the mind that receives it tonight is only a guest. We take no trophies from the evening, only the impression that authority leaves a scent, like incense lingering long after a service ends. A river keeps company with the road for a stretch, slipping past black roots and the pale ankles of birches. It is not a grand river, not yet. It is a thought that will one day become a plan. The water remembers 1,000 sets of footsteps on the shallow crossing and cannot tell one from another. If it speaks, it tells only what water can tell, that everything moves, that eddies look like stillness but are not, that absence can be a kind of current. In that lesson there is comfort because what is lost may still be carried. Beyond the trees, kitchens drowse and lamps gutter. A woman holds a child whose hair has never tasted a blade, swearing that it will remain so until a comet no one has yet seen departs the sky. Oaths take the shape of breath on glass, bright for a moment and then gone, but still remembered as a warmth on the pane. Not all vows become policy. Not all policies are announced. Tonight, the house god hears a different prayer. Let the rider return. Let the dog bark. Let the door open again. The chronicles we will read soon enough are like ponds reflecting clouds, useful, lovely, and sometimes misleading about what lies beneath. For now on the road itself, the only text is the small displacement of ferns, where a boot left its sentence unfinished. If there was a signal, a hand raised by a man half hidden behind alder trunks, no one records the exact angle, the exact breath taken before. The story persists with the precision of silence. Its clarity grows as its detail thins. Imagine the last sensations, the hiss of the wind, the heavy cloth aspiring to flight, a sweetness on the air where crushed leaves release their green, the dog waiting for the cue that never comes, the horse flicking a fly with a tired ear. The body's learning that heat departs faster than one expects. This is not spectacle. It is the smallest of closures laid upon the largest of symbols, like a moth alighting on a bell and quieting it without effort. In time, men who never walked this road will argue at tables about the cause, their fingers against parchment, their candles defiant against the dark. They will write as if every space between words were harmless. Yet the blank is where meaning concentrates, the space where a tomb should be named, where a witness should speak, where a boy's name, if boy there was, should continue a line like a river continues a valley. We will come to those spaces and handle them lightly. We will not force answers where the page offers only a margin. For now we keep the pace the forest teaches, unhurried and respectful. The hunt has dispersed. The torches are small stars now, bobbing toward villages that prefer sleep to verdicts. We are left with the sound of the road settling back into itself, and a hush that feels not like fear, but like reverence. The king is absent. The office remains. The story breathes as if through cloth, the breath steady and low. A bell note returns, thin and silver, then holds. Candle smoke far away in a scribe's room draws into a slender arrow and points at a page that will blink when we look at it. The wind, satisfied that we have heard enough, gathers its choir and moves towards stone and ink. Follow the smoke as it thins. Follow the bell as it fades. It is already reaching for the margin where a sentence breaks, inviting us to read what isn't there. The candle smoke we followed from the forest narrows into a thin gray ribbon and settles above a desk. A scribe bends to his work, the knife for trimming quills placed like a small moon beside the ink. The room is cool, stone-breathed, patient with silence. Outside, rain troubles the gutters. Inside, the page waits for a history that may or may not arrive in time. Early medieval writing moves like weather through scattered valleys. There are chronicles that speak, and then there are years that merely breathe and pass. Letters survive because a wall was thick, a roof held, a steward paid the parchmenter, a novice kept a lamp from tipping. What we call the record is sometimes not intention but luck, a net drawn through dark water, catching shells and letting the fish go. When we look for the years around 679, the ink thins. One chronicle stops short, another begins too late. A third remembers different kings with louder deeds. The death of Dagobert stands like a hill in fog, solid beneath the hand, indistinct in its edges. You can circle it and never be sure how wide it is, only that your steps tilt at the same angle each time. Names of volumes appear like distant bells, histories written in Latin years after the fact, continuations pieced together by hands loyal to a new order. Monks in Metz, monks farther west, each shaping story into serviceable timber for the houses their patrons built. The past becomes a beam. The beam learns to carry a roof. The roof shelters a claim, and claims prefer their corners square. On one page there is a small star in the margin. It could have been a flourish, a reminder, the private emblem of a tired man marking a passage he liked. On another copy, there is nothing, only the slow brown of age, moving across vellum like a soft tide. Between these two pages, an argument grows, and we forget that both were made by hands that shook a little when the bell for Compline sounded. The scribes of this time did not all write to deceive, nor did they all write to reveal. They wrote to survive the day, to render praise, to satisfy stewards who measured wax and lamp oil and tally marks of grain. A dynasty rose, a dynasty waned. The ink responded with courtesies and ellipses. If you wanted a fact to persist, you taught it to sing in the right choir stall. Some windows are bright. A letter mentions a king by name and then falls back into prayer. A sermon alludes to the sin of those who lift a hand against the anointed and then turns to the Beatitudes. A charter names rivers and fields, but leaves the hunter unnamed. we are left with the shape of a story pressed into negative space, as if a pot had been removed and only the ash pattern remained. Consider the pressure of later memory. A new line of rulers needs a clean beginning, like a loaf cut square at dawn. Chroniclers look back with careful faces and decide which knots in the wood to sand smooth. The old sacral gestures, uncut hair, healing touch, visions, are left in the previous room with the door pulled almost, but not entirely, closed. No decree says forget, yet forgetting takes root like ivy in mortar. In this atmosphere, a death can be at once known and under-described. The king fell. God's will was spoken aloud. The work of the fields resumed. Even where writers were sympathetic, caution kept the sentences short. We have more ink for the long arc, the migration of power to stewards, the eventual anointing of a different family, than for the hinge itself, the afternoon when one body failed and the next chapter began to breathe. To read such pages is to read the margins as much as the lines. Watermarks bloom where a roof once leaked. The faint trace of a palimpsest shows letters that do not belong to the current story, a ghost alphabet pressed beneath the present. Wormholes turn dates into constellations. A note in a different hand corrects a number, and then loses courage. The amended figure scratched lightly, as if not to wake the page. It is tempting to speak of deliberate erasure, and sometimes that will be true. It is also tempting to speak of accident, and often that will be true as well. In monastic libraries, truth and chance share shelves. A fire forgets to stop at the cabinet with the dry years and carries on into the ardent ones. A writer delivering a chronicle chooses a different bridge and meets a flood. History can be lost by weather and saved by a sleepy gatekeeper who happens to be stubborn about keys. Yet there is a rhythm to the silence that invites interpretation. The gap sits where a certain shape of kingship would have posed a problem to later tellers. A sovereign whose hair meant more than a crown, whose touch was said to heal, whose line might claim a sacral current. Such a figure is difficult to domesticate in prose meant to bless a new order. The safest way to manage a flame is not to blow on it, but to let it seek its own lack of air. A soft hum enters the room where the scribe works. It could be the draft, or the bees dozing in the monastery wall, their winter music a thread of sleep inside the stone. The scribe dips his pen. He writes a name, a year, a verb. Then he pauses, perhaps because a thought he cannot write sits in his chest like a warm coin. He moves on. We, centuries later, hear the pause more than the word. Across the desk lies a list of kings to be copied into the necrology of a great church near Paris. The names fall like steps in a long nave, one then another, then another. Most will be given a place in stone, their effigies lying with hands in prayer, their dates lectured by guides to visitors whose shoes whisper on the polished floor. The list is impressive, nearly full. The kind of fullness that makes a single absence show like a candle missing from a candelabrum. When copyists prepare such lists, they are not always present to the politics those lists will summon in later centuries. They mark what is customary, what is expected, what finds agreement at the tables where abbots meet envoys. A blank entry may mean the knowledge was not at hand. It may also mean the knowledge was inconvenient to hold. Paper, like conscience, has ways to fold around what cannot be comfortably displayed. So we come to the threshold between ink and stone, between the chronicle that blinks and the basilica that looks without blinking at the generations entrusted to its care. The scribe sands his page, breathes once to clear stray fibers, and lifts the sheet like a fragile sky. The quill is cleaned. The lamp pinches its flame smaller. The hum in the wall softens until it feels like the pulse in the wrist. Outside, the rain has stopped. The gutters flick their last drops into a little courtyard where herbs grow in tidy order. A bell is rung, not loud, not urgent, just enough to gather the day into evening. If you stand at the doorway, the sky has the color of pewter washed thin. The smoke from the lamp takes its cue and rises, not as an arrow now, but as a veil, spreading toward a place where names are carved. Follow the veil through chilled air and quiet streets. Follow it beneath an arch where winter sleeps, along a road where carts do not hurry, into the broad hush of a church that keeps the history of kings as if it were keeping time. Stone receives your footfalls and returns them as a slower sound. The nave opens like a river of dusk, and ahead where memory loves its marble, a space waits where a name should be. The veil of smoke that left the scribe's lamp thins into night air and finds its way to a northern suburb of Paris, where stone gathers itself into solemn music. Here stands the Basilica of Saint-Denis, cool even in summer, a harbor of arches and colored light. The floor receives footsteps the way a river receives rain, folding each sound into a larger hush that has learned patience from centuries. Builders once taught light to kneel here. It enters high windows, is sifted by glass into blues and rubies, and lands on marble like silk folded over bone. Pillars rise as if they had remembered trees and chosen to grow, this time without leaves. Near the crossing, air smells faintly of wax and old incense. The basilica seems to prefer whispering. It holds rumor and prayer with the same steady hands. This is the place guides call the home of kings. Stone effigies lie on their backs, with palms pressed in eternal recollection, faces composed, eyes lifted to a heaven that the windows rehearse. Names ride the edges of sarcophagi, neat, old letters that still breathe. A line of France unfolds in limestone, Merovingian whispers, Carolingian ribs, Capetian and Valois, and Bourbon sleepers, a nation arranged as if on a great still staff of music. Walk slowly, and the tombs feel like mile markers of legitimacy. One reign begets another. One dynasty hands a key to the next. A child stares at a carved hound sleeping at a queen's feet. An old man touches the inscription of a date he once learned by heart. Somewhere a guide's voice pours quietly through headphones, careful with consonants, careful with wonder. The dead are not disturbed. The living are steadied. In such abundance, absence becomes visible. The catalog is nearly full, and because it is nearly full, the missing entry draws the eye like a candle gone from a ring of candles. In pamphlets and plaques, in the murmured list a docent knows by muscle memory, a certain name does not find its stone home. The ear, expecting the note, notices only the breath where that note should be. Dagobert appears, but it is the first of that name, a king whose burial is honored within these walls. The second, the one whose last hunt we have just walked, does not lie here in carved certainty. The basilica keeps many answers, For this single question, it offers a shrug as elegant as any arch. The silence is not hostile, only perfected, like a sentence cut short deliberately to avoid error. Great churches are not merely basins for truth. They are vessels for caution. Bodies were moved, rebuilt, hidden, displayed, violated, and restored across storms of time. Bones mingled and separated like tributaries meeting and parting. It is possible a grave was made elsewhere for reasons both practical and politic. It is possible the memory of that place dimmed, or was gently dimmed, until it matched the light of a distant candle seen from a moving cart. Descend to the crypts, and the air gets older by degrees. The corridors read like a past written in stone rather than ink, each alcove a paragraph, each sealed arch a sentence that no longer wishes to be spoken aloud. In one chamber, centuries stack themselves like quiet books. A low gate closes a passage for safety, the sign says, though safety is a word elastic enough to carry both engineering and prudence. The echo returns softly, as if reluctant to disturb names. Return to the nave and look again, and the absence is a second architecture nested inside the first. It asks kindly, where did the body go, or where was it laid to begin with? It draws lines on the map that point away from Paris, north and east, toward forests and rivers, toward places where memory took on simpler clothes and walked among villagers who preferred candles to tapestries. The question does not accuse. It invites a journey. Along that other road lies Stenay, a town that once kept a small cult for a king named Dagobert, the second of that name. There were stories of visions that pointed to a burial, stories of healings that gathered around the place like bees to clover, stories of a saint king honored without the sanction of a grand necropolis. For a while the candles multiplied. Then, as policies changed and fashions of sanctity shifted, they burned lower and lower until the wicks slept under their wax. A bishop writing in a later century would record a dream that guided attention to a grave. A chapel would receive footsteps, and those footsteps would dissolve into grass. The great basilica in Paris would not change its mind. Paris very seldom does. Stenay would keep its modest memory like a locket under a plain blouse. The difference between marble and field is mostly a matter of funding and intention. Memory survives in both. Back again beneath the rose window, you feel how tombs make arguments without raising their voices. They say continuity. They say blessing. They say with gentle insistence, this line proceeds. When a tomb is missing, the argument develops a pause that may be filled by other instruments, the pen, the rumor, the map with its discrete symbols. Absence can be a kind of author. It allows other hands to finish the phrase. A necropolis is a literature in stone. It teaches a grammar of power. Effigies with careful curls speak of rank. Lions and dogs imply valor and fidelity. Queens hold their books as if the wisdom were still warm. The carved hair on many brows flows in orderly waves, a stylized version of life's disarray, made suitable for eternity. You can read an entire treatise on sovereignty by gazing from plat to plat, and noting how the chisel preferred order to wind. If you linger, you notice how air moves around these sculpted locks, how the drafts inside the nave toy with edges of stone that pretend to be hair. It is not difficult to imagine, just for a pulse or two, that hair matters more than metal, that the authority the effigies perform is not only in crowns, but in the suggestion of something uncut and therefore unbroken. The basilica does not affirm this, but it does not object. It simply holds its pose and lets meaning travel where it will. Outside, the town continues with its errands. Vendors pack away fruit that will bruise if it sleeps where it stands. School children practice a hymn that will rise here next week in clean intervals. Inside, a keeper trims the wick of a candle so that its smoke will be civilized. The trimmed black thread curls like a fallen strand, and for an instant, before it disappears, it looks like the sign of a promise, older than the stone that shelters it. Stand once more at the rail that overlooks the royal dead and measure, not with a scholar's rule, but with a sleeper's intuition, the space where a king might have been. The mind builds a tomb out of questions. It sets a figure there, not to deceive, but to complete the pattern long enough to feel the pattern's pull. Then it lets the figure go, as water lets a leaf go, and watches the current discover a different channel. When we leave, the door receives us with its slow iron and generous hinge. Evening lies on the town like a quiet shawl. Somewhere far beyond these streets, a smaller church will be preparing its candles, and a single bell, unpretentious, a little cracked, will rehearse a name that the larger basilica keeps in reserve. The two notes do not quarrel. They simply keep time in different registers, each certain of its own work. The light outside cools toward gray. Wind lifts hair from the forehead and sets it gently back, as if reminding the skin of an older ordinance. What kings wore as sign and sacrament, the air still understands as law. Before we turn toward the road again, glance at the effigies, at the stone curls that will remain obedient forever. Think of real hair, heavy with meaning, moving of its own accord in weather and prayer. The nave lowers its voice, and our path bends toward the story of the long-haired kings. The path bends, and the nave's chill dissolves into a warmer air where memory wears flesh again. We have left the marble curls of effigies for hair that once lifted in wind and prayer, hair that meant more than ornament. The Merovingians were called the long-haired kings, Reges Criniti, a title that sounded less like fashion than jurisdiction. To see that length was to be reminded that sovereignty began before the crown and would, in theory, outlast it. The sign lived on the body, close as breath. Hair was a banner that could not be planted in the wrong field. It was carried everywhere the king walked, a quiet proclamation even in sleep. A cut would not merely tidy, it would transfigure, sliding a man from sacrament to citizen, from king to monk or prisoner. Courts understood the symbol with a clarity sharper than steel. A knife to the hair could accomplish what an army sometimes could not, the end of a claim without a river of blood. Imagine mourning at a Merovingian court, the low wooden hall brightened by hangings and the smoke of hearths. A boy is brought before the assembly, his hair held in a ribbon that has never known a blade. Women plait it with a care that borders on devotion. Men look and measure futures in the fall of those strands. The child's presence is not a promise written, but a promise woven, thick and visible, declaring continuity in a language the illiterate could read. The idea reached backward and forward through the age, braiding law with legend. In a world where relics carried authority, hair felt like a living relic, renewed daily, guarded like an altar cloth, touched with reverence and sometimes with fear. If a king's hair embodied something sacred, then his body too stood near the threshold of shrine and throne. The boundary blurred in candle smoke. It smelled of tallow and myrrh. It sounded like chant woven into grain accounts. Stories grew around the sign as moss grows around a stone that never moves. One tells of a mother who vowed never to cut her son's hair until a comet, still unseen, had crossed the sky and fallen from the world's memory. The comet arrived and went. The boy became a man, and the scissors, though ready, learned patience longer still. Whether the tale was ever true matters less than what it meant, that heaven and hair could be linked in a single thread of time. The kings themselves cultivated an air of nearness to the holy, not as priests, but as bearers of a charged dignity. Certain hands were said to soothe a fever, certain touches to calm a swelling. A pilgrim might petition a ruler as one petitions a saint, not because doctrine endorsed it, but because people live close to their hopes. Skeptics, even then, could shrug and call it theater. Believers could point to the child who slept. The record, such as it is, remains tactful. Vision, too, was a currency traded in these courts. Queens dreamt of baptisms. Bishops dreamt of kings set right by luminous hands. The Frankish realms inherited Rome's roads and bishops' networks, and along those lines moved letters that stitched the mundane to the miraculous. A ruler's authority was legal, military, and economic, but it also inhaled the air of shrines. If legitimacy were a garment, the threads mingled law with light until they could not be easily separated. Consider the weight of that garment on an ordinary day. The king travels with a retinue, warriors in muted mail, clerks with tablets, servants ferrying bread and hides. Somewhere in the procession a chest holds oil for baptisms, though the royal anointing that will define later centuries belongs to another house. The Merovingian claim is older in texture, more bone and blood than ceremony. The nation is felt in the hair at a brow as much as in the sword on a belt. Language did its part to keep the magic close. Chronicles spoke of consecrated heads and heredity like a spring found inside a hill. If a prince's hair grew unchecked, it was as if time itself agreed to keep a promise. When a king entered a church, the candlelight courted his profile. When he left, the same light hung in the air a moment longer, as if unwilling to let the sign depart. People looked up and found themselves steadier for having looked. Time, however, is fond of testing symbols. Crop failures and border quarrels do not bow to hair. Administrations thicken. Treasuries learn to count. The attention of power slides along the benches to the man who keeps the ledgers neat and the couriers punctual. In such seasons, sacral signs must share the room with practical excellence. A king's touch may charm a crowd. A steward's memo ensures the hay gets cut before the rain arrives. Both are a kind of mercy. One is warmer to the ear. Even so, the long hair did real work in the minds of subjects and rivals alike. It reminded the cohort that this body was not interchangeable, that the office was not a cloak to be lent and returned. The uncut head suggested continuity that could not be casually torn. If the scalp carried sovereignty, then a conspirator's knife had to aim higher than the ribs. Theft of power would require a liturgy of cutting as sober, in its way, as a funeral. That liturgy, when it came to be used, had the elegance of economy. A single shearing could settle debates that armies might prolong. The deliberate fall of hair accomplished, before witnesses, the translation of a man into a safer category. It was less a humiliation than a rerouting. The shorn might be steered to monastery or manor, to script or silence, while the world arranged itself around the newly empty chair. The ritual promised peace, where steel promised grief. The court learned to live with two tempos, the slow ceremony of presence and the quick arithmetic of governance. On feast days, the king stood like a pillar wrapped in sound. On market days, clerks mended roads with numbers. The first tempo belonged to hair, to relics, to story. The second tempo belonged to reeds cut for pens, to oxen tallies, to the thin whistle of an awl through leather. Each tempo was true. Each believed itself indispensable. Listen closely, and a faint hum creeps into the hall, not from bees exactly, but from the seam where symbol meets administration. It is the hum of a world discovering it can be managed by schedules, that bread arrives on time when someone keeps a master list of mills. The hum does not cancel the chant. It steadies it, makes it predictable, asks it to share the hour with a ledger. In the sharing, something changes. A new center of gravity appears. Even the hair understands the weather. In wind, it lifts into glory. In rain, it darkens and clings. In the counting house, it merely exists, noticed but no longer consulted for policy. The men who defer to it still bow, but their knees are beginning to bend toward a different authority. The man who knows what each province owes and what each abbey can be persuaded to give. Honor keeps one shape in the chapel and another in the council. There is no sudden betrayal in this shift, only the quiet calculus of a realm learning to survive its own size. A rider sent to collect dues will return when paid. A rider sent to harvest awe may return to rumor. Awe does not stack like grain. It does not winter well in a damp granary. Hair can carry meaning. It cannot carry timber. The roads want gravel. The bridges want repair. Somewhere, a steward prepares a list that will keep a river of carts moving through spring. And so the long-haired kings continue, but their shadow tilts. The sign still breathes. The strands still fall over shoulders. The people still glance and find their hearts leveled. Yet the hinge has begun to turn. In rooms adjacent to ceremony, men with wax tablets and cautious smiles practice a different craft, the art of placing the world in order without invoking thunder. They do not cut, they count, they do not command, they arrange. The day closes. Smoke climbs toward rafters and spreads like a quiet canopy. A lock clicks somewhere in the complex, not harshly, simply to keep the papers safe from drafts. Outside, the wind lays a gentle hand across the fields and sets the barley whispering. The hair in the hall catches that same wind and settles back against the neck. Between strand and ledger, between chant and schedule, tomorrow waits. Follow the hum toward the bench where the steward sits, his stylus poised. The quill's shadow lengthens. The age of the mayor of the palace draws its chair closer to the fire. The hum that gathered at the edge of ceremony steps forward and takes a chair. It is the sound of counting, of careful hands placing small stones in bowls to tally dues, of quills drying upright like reeds by a winter river. In this room the light is practical, the benches worn smooth by elbows that learned authority without wearing a crown. The title is simple, Mayor of the Palace, yet the work spreads like roots beneath a hall. At first it meant what the words suggest: master of the royal household, keeper of keys, steward of stores, overseer of stables and kitchens, and the ebb and flow of gifts. But as seasons turned and distances lengthened, the household became a miniature of the realm, and the steward's habits became policy. What was once the arrangement of bread and candles widened to the arrangement of tribute and riders, and the timing of harvests that could feed an army. Watch a morning unfold. Messengers arrive 2 by 2, their cloaks salted with road dust, their horses steamed to a faint ghost in the cool air. They dismount in a rhythm older than any one reign, hand over packets sealed with wax that smells faintly of bees, and take watered wine while their news is sorted. The mayor breaks seals not with flourish but with economy, reads, and sets each sheet into a growing orchard of decisions. He knows who owes carts and who owes men, who holds a ford and who can repair a bridge, which abbey's barns are full, and which village's threshing failed in the rain. Names carry weights in his fingers: a son returned from illness, a widow who can be trusted with winter's salt, a captain whose pride needs stroking before the levy will sing. The page listens to the stylus and becomes a map more accurate than any drawn in colors. Some mayors were minor notes who kept the tune, others learned to conduct. In the East, Austrasia, the office gathers strength early, buoyed by families whose memory flowed farther back than most. Papin of Landen sets a pattern. His kin move along the grain of custom, until custom itself begins to lean in their direction. In time, a Pepin of Herstal will inherit the habit and make it decisive, not with trumpets, but with schedules that always arrive. There is a battle, and the name of it will be copied later into books. A field, where the mayor's party broke a rival's confidence and turned the wind. Such moments look like thunder from a distance. Up close, they feel like the last bead on an abacus sliding into place. Afterward, the king smiles in public and receives the salutations that keep the sky from falling. The mayor retires to a smaller room and opens tomorrow's mail. Nothing here wishes to insult the old sign. The uncut hair still moves people. It still steadies the heart, like the sight of a river at flood, contained by its banks. Yet when the king bows his head for a blessing, the steward notes which roads are passable after the storm, and which must be mended before the grain can travel. Awe stands like a statue. Order keeps the statue from cracking in frost. Bees belong to this world even when no hive is in sight. They live inside the seals that soften near the lamp. They live in the honeyed tea that soothes a messenger's cough. They live in the image that administration takes of itself, a living geometry where each movement serves a center. The mayor learns the pitch of that hum and holds it steady, arranging flights that look like chaos from the field and like music from above. Imagine the muster in late spring. Horns lift and fold their notes into the open country. Men arrive in units that grew out of villages and loyalties. A clerk ticks names. Another tallies spears, slings, leather straps that keep saddles honest. Grain is measured into bags whose knotting has been standardized by a baker who hates waste. Behind all this, the mayor nods once at the captain who solved the bridge problem by borrowing carts from a tannery upriver. Such men acquire the habit of ruling, while insisting they are merely keeping. They sit a little behind the throne, slightly to the left, where light is good but attention is polite. At the council, they let others speak first and then sew the arguments together with a thread no one notices until the garment holds. Their virtue is patience, their power is persistence, their weapon is the calendar. Families accrete around the office the way swallows accrete around a warm roof. Marriages and loyalties weave themselves into a net that can be cast across provinces. Pepin of Herstal holds two worlds in balance, one of banners and one of ledgers. And when he dies, there is a pause, like the moment before rain. A woman named Plectrude keeps a corner of the pattern tidy with the authority of her own lineage. A son not favored in charters, Charles, finds his way through iron rather than seals. Years afterward, people will speak softly of that Charles as if his name were a door that opens to a room with different air. He becomes the kind of mayor who rides, who thinks with maps under his ribs, who trusts tallies, but also teaches fear to enemies. Along river bends and hill spurs, he establishes the habit of winning. When he rests, he is still counting. And when he counts, he is thinking how to place a friend where a rival once dined. In this season, churches feel the shift as surely as farms. A new logic touches old wealth. Land once counted as quiet becomes a way to pay men whose knuckles guarantee the horizon. Abbots mutter, then negotiate. Theias then discover that the world has not ended, but only learned a different table grace. Psalms still rise, bread still bakes, yet the mayor's handwriting threads the margins of devotional life like a vine that refuses to be pruned to anyone else's notion of neat. The king remains. Processions assemble, and the uncut sign passes through the air like a slow comet with a tale of hymns. Women lift children so they can see and be steadied in their own small storms. The mayor watches with the same care he gives to oxen counts. He is too practiced to sneer, too practical to genuflect from habit. He understands the uses of light as well as of grain, how both can be placed where they do the most good at least cost. At dusk, the palace quiets to its evening chores. The kitchen erases the day's heat with pails of water. The yard smells of horse, leather, and a faint iron that never quite leaves the air of men who plan for war, even as they plan for peace. Somewhere a young clerk reheats wax and presses a signet gently enough that the seal holds, but does not crack. He admires the small crest's precision and wonders who designed it, never thinking the design is itself a kind of government. On the wall hangs a sword with a grip polished by centuries of hands. Next to it hangs a set of shears, ordinary in every respect. No one consults them for policy. No one gives them a name. Yet history, pausing in this twilight, considers both tools with equal interest. One shouts, the other whispers. One ends a battle, the other ends a claim. Both, at the right hour, can move a nation without moving far at all. The night lengthens, and the hum settles into the grain of tables and the pores of stone. The mayor closes his last packet, takes a moment to watch the lamp's flame draw a small, disciplined cone against the dark, and pinches it down with practiced fingers. In the corridor, a draft lifts a forgotten strand of hair and lays it back upon the stair. The gesture looks like nothing, and like a rehearsal. Sleep presses its seal on the palace. Tomorrow, the same order will reappear. Riders, lists, wax, judgments that feel like weather because they arrive with such regularity. But something waits just outside the circle of lamplight. a decision that turns ritual into instrument. Follow the corridor toward a quieter room where a monk keeps a small box of oils and a folded length of linen. In the stillness, you can almost hear the whispering hinge of shears opening and closing once, then once again, as if practicing the shape of a future sentence. Night presses its seal on the counting room, and with morning the benches wake to a different ceremony. The mayor of the palace walks in measured pace, not toward ledgers this time, but toward a space cleared for oil and prayer. The air smells of beeswax and fresh linen. A pair of shears waits on a cloth with the composure of a small moon. Quiet men with careful hands will decide how a century turns. Pepin is not tall, but height is a conversation for doors and tapestries. History measures in other units, steadiness, timing, the calm that knows when to step from shadow into light. He has watched the long-haired kings steady hearts, while the stewards steady roads. He has learned that bread must arrive before hymns can carry their full sweetness. Today, two rivers meet, sacral sign and administrative habit, and the country listens for the sound they make together. Before such joining, there is a question sent to Rome as one would send a letter into weather. If one man holds the work and another holds the title, which should the world call king? The answer returns with the weight of distant roofs and bells, an answer that prefers the name to follow the labor. Words travel, doors open. The calendar, proud of its routine, secretly anticipates a new feast. An anointing would once have belonged primarily to saints and altars. Now it learns a second craft, blessing ahead so that governance will wear a gleam the people can love. In a hall at Soissons, hands accustomed to chrism trace holy circles on a brow that has long known helmets and council hoods. Oil runs like a thin river, finding the low places in the skin, gathering in the quiet above the eyes. A new king receives what the old kings once embodied without help, the sensation that heaven approves. The gesture does not insult the past. Dagobert's road still rustles with leaves. The long hair still moves like a relic in the mind. Yet today the sign is transferred from strand to sacrament, from what grows to what is given. The crown that follows is not only metal, it is the memory of oil drying on skin, of a choir's breath turning the room into shelter. People watching feel taller, as if ceilings had been raised. Elsewhere, a different rite unfolds with fewer witnesses and more consequence than its quiet suggests. A last Merovingian sits with the patience learned by men who have been watched all their lives. A monk opens the shears with a sound that hardly registers in air but carries cleanly across centuries. Hair falls in obedient arcs, brown or gold, depending on which light one imagines. Each curl lands like a comma in a long sentence that has decided to stop. There is nothing cruel in the hands that hold the hair. The cruelty, if any, is in the idea that a sign can be unmade so simply. Yet the idea works. When the shears close for the final time, the man is as alive as the hour before, but is no longer the place where a line continues. He will live behind stone and chant, in a monastery that keeps time as well as any court. The kingdom exhales and tries on its new arrangement like a cloak cut by a different tailor. Meanwhile, Pepin learns a second anointing, as if to seal the first with a new wax. A pope travels north, welcomed through cities that discover how quickly they can clean their thresholds. In a great church near Paris, the chrism returns, this time with a promise that jumps generations, Not only this man, but the sun struck from his house shall wear the gleam. The words leave a line of light down the future where names not yet chosen will walk. The alliance binds two needs that had looked at one another across mountains. South of these rivers, a bishop of Rome faces neighbors who prefer iron to nuance. North of the Alps, a family of stewards needs a grammar that makes their habit of ruling unmistakable. Between them grows a compact, a gift of land and protection for the bishop, a gift of sacral polish for the household that already kept the ledgers straight. Churches ring, forges ring. The sound makes one chord. Not every ear rejoices. Some remember the uncut sign and feel the world tilt away from an older intimacy with the holy. Some think of kings' hands that soothed fevers and dream of a time when the border between altar and throne was a mist that people walked through without noticing. Others, practical as weather, note that grain travels faster now, that bridges hold, that enemies think twice, and then, once again. Sleep comes easier when roads are predictable. In the palace, insignia rearrange themselves with the politeness of furniture slid a little closer to a window. The lily trims its point. The bee appears in margins where only oak leaves used to rest. The steward's handwriting still rules the day, but it now carries a sheen borrowed from sacristy. An order written after an anointing believes itself steadier than the same order written before, and belief is a tool administrators use better than anyone. What happened to the hair that fell? No inventory records it, yet it clings to imagination like incense to cloth. A sacristan might have swept it into a small pouch and kept it out of habit, unsure whether relic or refuse had just been delivered into his care. A queen might have held a single strand and then let it go, the way one releases a bird and listens for the moment when flight becomes distance. Perhaps nothing of the sort occurred, and still the mind prefers to store a curl in an unseen reliquary. Pepin governs in a key that feels almost like silence. He prefers decisions that look inevitable a week later, and victories that allow enemies to save face in public while conceding essentials in private. Under such weather, fields learn confidence. At harvest, carts move without surprise, from granary to garrison. In winter, payments arrive before hunger's voice turns sharp. Children grow used to seeing the king less than hearing of him, a rumor of steadiness behind their parents' plans. His house acquires a miracle of patience, a son whose name will lengthen in the mouths of poets and chroniclers until it sounds like iron laced with wind. That boy will learn to ride across maps as if they were fields newly scythed. He will make schoolmasters busy inventing new ways to say boundary. But he is not yet the measure of the room. For now Pepin sits where he has always sat, closer to the work than the ceremony, and lets the empire to be hum inside the modest kingdom. And what of the deposed one? Tonsure scars heal. Chants memorize themselves. A man once watched because he embodied a claim becomes a man watched because he keeps hours. Bells call him not to counsel, but to lauds, to prime, to the careful staircase of the day. His name grows quiet, then softer still, until it is a kind of weather in a valley few visit except by mistake. The world has not ended. It has been sorted. The shears rest again on their cloth, innocent as moons. Oil vessels are returned to their cupboards. The floor remembers where knees pressed and forgets, and remembers again when sweeping dislodges a tiny glint of wax. A door closes with the courtesy of well-oiled iron. Outside, wind moves through barley, imitating the gesture made so formally within. A laying down, a smoothing, a consent to a new line of growth. The country does not cheer, it settles. If you listen past the applause of practical minds, you can hear another music, older, fainter, wondering whether something precious has been safely transferred or gently diminished. The answer refuses to speak in daylight. It will prefer to wait under trees, near water, where the long-haired kings once walked, without needing oil to shine. There a small cult once kept a flame for a name that larger stones forgot. Follow the evening road northward. The candles of Stenay are patient, and their smoke knows how to point. The road leaves the great necropolis and turns to smaller lanes, following the Meuse as it learns its curves by heart. Poplars lift their narrow hands to the wind, and fields fold themselves into the river's patient silver. Toward evening, the roofs of Stenay appear, brown and practical, a town that looks like it knows every one of its own footsteps. The bell here is humbler than Paris, but it rings with a confidence borrowed from water. You enter by a bridge that remembers hooves, and the river answers with soft applause under the arches. Shops set out their last bread. Shutters lean in. A boy cycles past with a loaf held in one hand like a warm, edible lantern. At the town's quieter edge waits a church whose stones have learned to listen. Not a cathedral's blaze, rather a hearth's heat. Steady, not showy. Sufficient for pilgrims who prefer a bench to a guidebook. Inside, the light is shallow, gold, where candles write short poems on the walls. Along a side aisle, ex-votos hang like small, rescued hearts. Wax legs, wax arms, a wax eye with a black dot for sight, each one a grammar of gratitude. You read a few names in cramped penmanship: Sabine, Jean, a child called Eloi, whose fever broke on the 5th night, and feel how the century makes room on its lap for those who whisper their thanks in a corner seat. The dedication says Saint-Dagobert, and then says more carefully the second of that name. The letters do not shout. They rest. A scroll of local notes, pamphlets on a string, folded maps that smelled the damp and kept it, tells of a royal hunted man who did not return, and a grave that found a prayer. There is a story of a vision. A bishop in a later age sees light move in a dream, and in the light a place, and in the place a name that teaches the crowd how to walk. The bishop's name, people will tell you, was Hinsmar. He governed from Reims, a city where letters travel with the authority of voices trained to psalm. In the tale, he dreams of a hidden resting. He wakes with the courage to join rumor to ritual. The search that follows is modest, more candle than trumpet. Someone points, someone kneels. The ground does not argue. The hymn is unfamiliar, but easy to learn. Soon a small cult grows as nettles grow along a ditch, without permission, with order of its own. The faithful come on wet mornings carrying bread and names. A woman presses a wool cap to a knee and prays for a husband who limps like a man remembering snow. A boy stares at the painting of a king whose hair falls, as if it were listening to him. A jar fills with coins and then empties into the parish's hunger for roof and mend. A spring near the church takes on a gentler reputation. People begin to collect its water in bottles rescued from other purposes. A mother drenches a rag and ties it to a branch beside the path, cloth for sickness to climb into, according to the old way of speaking. Shrines do not argue theology. They demonstrate it with a child who sleeps, or an ankle that stops barking at the body with every step. The page will later call such proofs uncritical. The rooms where people live call them Tuesday. On feast days, the church lengthens itself with procession. The banner comes out, its edges frayed by rain, its center bright where a painted scepter refuses to learn fading. The song stays in a comfortable range where ordinary throats feel brave. They move along the river and back, a small weather system of hope that makes its own breeze. Shopkeepers watch and cross themselves less from fervor than from the quiet economics of belonging. Of course, time questions everything it accepts. A new abbot makes a tour and rubs his jaw at the crowds. A chapter reviews accounts and wonders how much candle smoke is strictly good for ceilings. A visitor from the capital, polite and well-dressed, suggests that sanctity should be managed by offices, not by rumor drifting in from fields. Letters fly. A file grows. The church keeps ringing for a while, then rings less, then remembers how to keep its bells silent without forgetting the notes. It is not that Stenay's devotion is extinguished so much as tidied away to the drawer where old linens are kept. Reform always loves a cupboard. The spring continues to wet what the earth will allow. The banner learns to rest more days than it walks. Candles burn for family tragedies rather than for kings whose names are roots now. Even so, the room retains a secret attentiveness, like a retired soldier who still sleeps facing the door. Artifacts begin to accumulate around the tail, the way thistles accumulate on a wool coat that brushed a field. A badge in tin, a candle end with hair folded into its base, a scrap of ribbon faded toward no color at all. A farmer claims he saw a stag stand and bow near a burial, not once but twice, on the day the frost finished the beets. A mason swears he found a tile stamped with a sign he could not read. He pockets it. He returns it. He pockets it again. The priest, one of several across the years, keeps a ledger with careful lines. He writes what modest miracle is told to him, and is honest when it sounds like weather dressed as providence. He also writes who brought flour to the poorhouse, and whose daughter can now climb stairs. Saint Dagobert, he writes in a margin, remembers the small. The remark feels like an apology and a vow. Ledger and litany sleep on the same shelf. From time to time, someone suggests that the Great Basilica in Paris ought to have a say, and Paris replies the way the sea replies to a creek. It does not refuse. It receives and does not change. Back in Stenay, the air holds steady. The town learns to live with its legend the way a family lives with a portrait whose subject no one met but everyone claims to resemble. The portrait anchors holidays. The likeness consoles quarrels. It asks quietly to be dusted. At the edge of town, a field keeps the biggest secret in the manner fields prefer by growing whatever is asked of them and refusing to speak while plows pass. Children are warned not to dig there. They dig elsewhere and forget the warning. A hunter walks his dog along the fence and pauses where a depression obliges his ankle. He looks around, embarrassed by the sudden wish to take off his hat. He rubs the dog's ear and keeps moving. Night in Stenay has its own inside voice. Crickets regulate it. The river softens it. A sweetness from someone's window argues cheerfully with damp stone. In the church, a jar of dead matches smells like last week's rain. Bees from a parishioner's hives, kept behind a wall where the sun hits generously, wander in sometimes and test the wax of the candles. The sexton does not mind. He has learned that hives are better neighbors than rumors, though both hum in key. And so the town holds two truths that do not quarrel. In Paris, stone arranges remembrance with the exactness of geometry. In Stenay, earth arranges it with the vagueness of affection. The one presents a thesis in marble, the other tells a story in breath. Between them runs the river, carrying pollen and silt, and the occasional prayer that fell out of a pocket on the bridge, and found better company among reeds. If you stand long enough at the back of the church, your eyes consent to the light, and details present themselves without hurry. A carved king gestures with 2 fingers raised, not blessing exactly, more like acknowledgement. A child touches his own hair as if remembering an instruction. Wax shines at different heights, a constellation of little suns that warm no planet and warm everything. The room is small, but smallness is what lets it fit into sleep. Toward closing, the priest dips a branch of boxwood and shakes water across the few who remain. It falls like gentler weather over a week that could have used a better sky. People make the sign that stitches their foreheads to their hearts. The bell sounds once, then twice. Doors answer, as doors always answer, by being useful. Outside, the river takes its evening color, and the fields lean toward it as if to hear what it will say about tomorrow. We leave by the bridge we crossed, and the planks remember. Behind us, candles shorten themselves with willing discipline. If the shrine has kept a secret, it has done so openly, where any passerby could have known had they wished to linger. The air, brushed by small wings from the hives, keeps a low music that seems to accompany the very act of thinking. Follow that hum as it slips into the seam of stone near a closed arch. A room on the other side waits without impatience, and somewhere within it a story breathes as if guarded by bees. The hum we carried out of Stenay slips along the mortar of an older wall and finds a seam where stone suggests a door. Here the air cools, as if it had spent the afternoon inside chalk. A small arch is bricked, lime-whitened, and patient. A key hangs in a niche nearby, ceremonial rather than useful, a reminder that not every lock expects to work. Crypt air has its own grammar, wax and damp, iron and prayer. Steps descend into a closeness that remembers winter even in August. Niches open like quiet mouths, some speaking names and years, others practicing silence as if it were a virtue. In that hush, a thinner sound threads through, a low, even vibration that seems too steady for breath and too shy for wind. The locals will tell you the bees live in the wall itself. They found a way, a sacristan once shrugged, as if insects and saints shared the same gift for doors where others see none. Hives stand behind the churchyard, sun-faced and busy in summer. When evening comes, a reconnaissance of strays investigates the cool interior, testing wax the color of old parchment, leaving a rumor of honey in the stone. On a bench rests a candle that dripped itself into sculpture months ago, stalactite pinned to saucer by intention and gravity. The wax holds wings marks, where inquisitive visitors pressed a finger and then regretted touching what seemed still molten. Light finds the cooled ridges and makes them glow like pale fruit. In this room, bees build without building. They lend their idea of order to everything that stands still long enough. Someone has pinned a copy of a curious notice near the sacristy cupboard, a fragment of 17th century Latin with the ink translated into calmer English at the bottom. The heading pretends to gravity. Chronicon Sionis, 1653. The lines speak of a chamber where a king of sacred stock was silenced, and of a vigil kept by bees, as if the hive itself learned liturgy. No seal certifies it. The script looks too neat to be entirely old, too old to be entirely new. Whether forged, mistaken, or sincerely misremembered, the phrase will not let go. A chamber, watched by bees. The mind accepts the image before it checks the footnotes. Bees suit these vaults better than torches. They carry the sense of work without alarm, watchfulness without hostility. They suggest a community that labors in the dark for a sweetness kept against lean days, returning always to a center that hums like a throat singing Amen. There is a precedent of another sort, also from that year of mid-century. A tomb opened far from here at Tournai, and a shower of small gold insects spilled from the earth. They were called bees by some, cicadas by others, little ovals with hooks for sewing to cloth, an old king's coat of glinting life recovered from mud. Those who lifted them let imagination find reasons before scholarship found terms. Symbols wake quickly when touched. The insects wandered into heraldry and into talk around hearths, catching the light of argument as easily as the light of day. If early Frankish kings loved the sign, or if later centuries loved believing they had, the result is the same. A grammar of sovereignty that prefers persistence to flash, industry to spectacle, life returning after winter to crowns that must survive both harvest and hunger. Bees, whether true or misread, make patient companions to rule. Return to the sealed arch and read the painted warning. Passage closed, for reasons of safety. The note is not recent, yet someone renews the paint whenever it fades beyond courtesy. Ask a keeper and you'll hear about unstable fill, about moisture that weakens mortar, about older works whose confidence in their own strength no longer rises to the standards of modern liability. The reasons are sensible, the tone apologetic, the chain across the aperture light but decisive. Still, stories do not respect chains. They flow through grates and gather in the lower corridors. A woman from a nearby farm once said her grandfather descended here before the last war and spoke of 3 shapes on one stone: man, woman, and a small figure between, laid with intent rather than accident. Another voice insists a scrap of leather with letters not Latin slept in a box beside those bones. The box is never produced. The voices age. The stories linger like scents housed in wood. If you sit long enough, the hum resolves and dissolves, more felt than heard, like a thought thinking itself. Real bees have their seasons. In winter they cluster and call it warmth. In spring they loosen and become visible. Their geometry a quiet arithmetic in air. The crypt keeps faith with that calendar. Sometimes the sound belongs only to your own pulse stroking your ear. Sometimes a stray from the hives buzzes one slow circle and decides the world outside is kinder. Pilgrims once took such noises for permission. Historians take them for ventilation at work. A building breathes by means of narrow slits and kind accidents of temperature. So do ideas. This chamber that may or may not exist behind the seal survives because both kinds of listeners, those who ask the bees, those who ask the brick, are willing to visit and then to leave without certainties curled in their pockets. Doubt can be a good neighbor when it behaves itself. In a glass case along the wall, labels from different decades have been slid behind the same artifacts, a palimpsest of curatorial caution. A shard is first called a chalice foot, then revised to roofing tile, then gently edited to object of devotion, domestic. The punctuation performing humility. Names blur in similar fashion. A king becomes a saint, becomes a curiosity, becomes a footnote that refuses to be planted where footnotes prefer to grow. Think of the craftsman who sealed the arch. His trowel laid commas of lime in careful arcs. His eye checked the plumb of each brick. His back kept score of hours as faithfully as any clerk. He is remembered nowhere, yet his wall is famous among people who will never know his name. He made a lid for a story and closed it without malice. Lid and story have coexisted ever since, like two clocks in the same room keeping time differently without breaking the room. In the candlelight, ornament plays tricks. A carved rosette, worn to a hexagon by centuries of fingers, looks suddenly like a cell from a perfect comb. Along a cornice, dots spaced for balance, read as insects mid-flight if you squint with the right kind of hope. No document claims these were intended, but intention is not the only way meaning arrives. Sometimes stone learns the alphabet whispered around it and begins, shyly, to speak. The year 1653 nestles strangely here, both near and far. In one place, workers pull gold insects from the earth and deliver them into history. In another, a text appears, or is said to appear, claiming that bees guard a royal quiet. The two streams meet in listeners' minds and make a larger river. Confluence is not proof, but rivers are useful even when their sources disagree. They carry timber and rumor with equal skill. Paths of devotion curve toward practical needs and back. A beekeeper from the outskirts offers a jar to the church for candle making, and on the label, in cramped hand, he draws a little crown above his name, a joke or a hope. No one can say. The sexton takes the jar and smiles, as if the exchange had repaired a small harm in the world. Wax burns cleanest when bees work free from fear. Stories burn cleanest when they are not forced to flame. At the far end of the crypt, a stair rises into an aisle the public no longer walks. A cord says so. A sign repeats it. The caretaker, tired from kindly sentences, confirms it without apology. The steps beyond look well behaved. Dust without drama, stone without complaint. Yet the mind equips them with echoes. The pad of an official boot, the whisper of a measuring tape, the sigh of fabric heavy with embroideries that pick up even the poorest candle's light. Perhaps that embroidered fabric belongs to a later visitor in our next room of time, a man who loved symbols that felt older than crowns, who studied insects recovered from an ancient grave and asked tailors to scatter their shapes on his new coat of empire. But that is for later. For now the hum stays low in the wall, the arch keeps its polite refusal, and the jar of dead matches smells like rain. We climb back today. The crypt surrenders us with the courtesy of stone that has learned to see visitors off without regret. Outside, bees take the sun and draw straight lines to clover, as if rulers had been laid across the air. A thread of gold crosses a passerby's sleeve and disappears. A trick of light or an omen or nothing at all. Follow the thread. It will lead to uniforms that glint like small hives and to corridors politely closed for safety, where history and caution share a key. Follow the thread of gold, From the crypt stairs into a different century, and it brightens into embroidery. Tailors bend over dark coats in rooms that smell of chalk and starch, pushing needles through cloth so heavy it keeps its own weather. On their tables, small shapes pile up by the hundreds, oval bodies with tiny wings, a geometry of industry worked in wire and thread. When the cloth moves, it glints as if a hive had learned to walk. An empire is about to declare itself, and it needs a heraldry older than yesterday. The fleur-de-lis belongs to kings who are gone and not entirely mourned. Its petals recall rooms full of bourbon mirrors that the new century prefers not to polish. The bee offers another story. It hums from deeper soil, from a grave opened long ago at Tournai, where golden insects spilled like sunlight surviving underground. A ruler looking for ancestry that precedes a quarrel finds in those insects a credential quieter than thunder and more persistent. Bees multiply across mantles and carpets, on canopies, coach hangings, saddlecloths. They climb borders like notes on a staff and turn fabric into murmuring fields. Courtiers stand in ranks that shimmer as if pollen had dusted them. At a distance, the effect is not showy so much as insistent. Small lives repeating a pattern until repetition becomes inevitability. Power borrows their patience and calls it fate. The choice is not merely decorative. Symbols are the grammar with which regimes conjugate themselves. A lily says lineage, sanctified continuity, a house that expects to be obeyed because it has always been obeyed. A bee says labor organized toward a center, winter survived by memory and method, sweetness stored against famine. The empire to be prefers to look like work wearing glory, not glory borrowing work. Tailors oblige, drums oblige. A city learns to hear footsteps as if they were wings. Now let that thread of gold carry you back under stone. After the revolution, Saint-Denis learned the weather of fury. Tombs were opened, statues were insulted, bones, shocked to find daylight, were moved and sometimes mixed until names could comfort no one. In time, the violence cooled and the basilica began to heal its surfaces. A later government, this new empire, ordered respect restored, not quite as the old kings would have wanted it, but enough to put the roof back over memory. In such restorations, engineers walk where pilgrims used to kneel. They chalk numbers on piers, measure the fatigue of arches, and listen with long poles pressed to their ears for tones only stone can give. Certain aisles, damp for decades, confess their doubts. A corridor sinks by the thickness of a finger. A vault shivers when carts pass the outer wall. Someone writes a note that becomes a sign. Passage closed for reasons of safety. The sign is honest and remains. Yet the mind, trained by absence to imagine presence, reads it twice. First as an engineer would, thinking of thrust lines and mortar made with the stinginess of lean years. Second as a listener does, hearing behind the caution the same old whisper. Not yet, not here. Not for eyes that blink. The chain is light. The refusal is gentle. Still, refusal has its own eloquence in a place built to tell. One can picture an inspection on a gray afternoon. Officials in plain coats descend with a lantern hung from a nail. A map is spread on a box that used to be a reliquary when names were less shy. Fingers move. Here the fill is irregular. Here there may be a void. Here, if a wall is opened, the vault above will sulk and perhaps forget itself. The lantern smokes. Someone coughs. The decision not to proceed becomes policy, and policy becomes routine, and routine becomes the dustiest kind of truth. Above ground, the bead design proliferates, flags rise along avenues, and even the upholstery seems to hum softly when no one sits. The sovereign stands wrapped in a mantle that has learned its own geography of insects, and the painter tasked with remembering the scene discovers that gold is a stubborn color to capture in oil. You can paint shine. You cannot paint sound. Still, anyone who looks at the portrait hears something, as if a field had been condensed into a garment. The bee joins the eagle and the thunderbolt in a duet of Roman and Frankish dreams. One symbol speaks of reach, another speaks of return. One flies to conquer, the other returns to the same small door, faithful to a nest it never doubts. Between them stands a man who values maps and laws, and the theater in which both are announced. He may never say the word Saint-Denis aloud in public, but his policy walks there in boots that prefer the predictable. When restorers clean the basilica's wounds, they do not erase the seams. You can still see where stone learned to be patient with plaster, where ribs that once felt infinite learned modesty under timber supports. The place survives as a teacher of two kinds of history, the kind that lies down in effigies and the kind that stands up in scaffolds. Visitors learn to lower their voices in both. Among the closed passages, a few become notorious to the faithful of rumor. A turn that leads nowhere. A gate installed where a step used to be. A window painted over rather than bricked, as if light had been asked politely to lose interest. Guides answer questions with the fixed gentleness of persons trained to receive the same question daily. They have good reasons, which is not the same as having satisfied listeners. The story of bees returns because the ear wants a consonant to close the syllable of secrecy. If golden insects stitched to a coronation robe can claim ancestry made of sunlight and antique grave goods, perhaps real insects here perform a vigil no human order asked of them. The thought is unprovable and comforting, like many thoughts carried to bed and folded under the pillow until morning. The crypts do not confirm it, and that is part of their work. In another quarter of the city, glass cases hold fragments from the age when bees first entered the conversation, rings, buckles, pendants, whose oval bodies could be cicadas or bees, or deliberate ambiguity. Scholars argue the taxonomy. Enthusiasts prefer the hum. Both groups are honest in their ways. The museum label advances and retreats over decades, learning to be precise where it can and to shrug where it must. Visitors stand and let gold teach them about time's different tempers. Return once more to Saint-Denis, to a docent whose key ring sounds like a small carillon. She unlocks a side door and opens it only a hand's width to show where statues sleep in wooden coffins waiting their turn at repair. The gap smells of spruce and cloth glue and patience. She closes it, locks it, and smiles the apologetic, invincible smile of someone who guards things precisely by not showing them. The smile is not a plot. It is a profession. Evenings the basilica learns a different light, a gray that flatters stone by admitting it is older than color. The closed aisle becomes a shadow folded into a larger shadow, nearly indistinguishable to the eye that moves quickly, plain to the eye that lingers. A boy asks his grandfather what lies there. The old man whispers, "Nothing safe," meaning weight and walls, meaning liability. meaning perhaps just that the world keeps some rooms for later. The child nods as if entrusted with a secret, and in a way, he is. If you step outside and walk the quiet streets, bees from gardens find the last flowers where heat holds out. They work without allegory, the way most of us do. Yet their lines seem to sketch across air the very corridors we were not permitted to enter, straight, precise, purposeful, returning to the hidden center neither anxious nor proud. You watch them until your eyes forget distance and see only motion in a net of light. Symbols have their migration patterns too. From a 6th century grave to a 17th century report to a 19th century mantle, the bee flies through centuries as if they were seasons. It leaves behind honeyed drips of meaning on the windowsills of chapels and palaces. When doors shut, gentle signs, polite chains, the bee simply chooses another entrance, usually through the listener's ear. The day cools. A custodian sweeps the nave, pulls chains across side chapels, and leaves the big doors on the latch for a final hour of wandering. The hum dwindles to the softest thread, scarcely sound, more like the feeling you get handling old paper, the dry whisper of fibers that have survived wars and cleaners and the boredom of safe years. That whisper is our next guide. Follow it away from stone, toward a reading room where lamps favor patience and chairs forgive long silences. Follow it into the company of maps whose edges curl like old leaves, of genealogies that try to turn breath into geometry, of dossiers that arrived one morning and have not stopped arriving ever since. The aisles behind us are closed with good reason. The pages before us open with reasons of their own. The reading room receives us with the kindness of green-shaded lamps and chairs that forgive long silences. Cotton gloves rest like folded moths beside a ledger, and the air keeps its steady hum. Radiators, not bees, though the note feels related. A cart rolls up with folders the color of toast. Inside the paper sleeps a rumor that once asked to be taken as lineage rather than literature, and for a time, the world obliged. Here the pages call themselves Dossier Secret de Henri Lobineau, a name that sounds as if it had known boats and old hotels. The sheets are calm in their confidence, genealogies drawn with impossible neatness, marginal dates that behave, a trail of names marching from shadowy Merovingians toward families who would never expect to find such ancestors in their morning mail. The ink arranges itself as if all gaps were solved, and it asks the eye to rest. Maps join the procession. One is a web. Rennes-le-Château near its center, lines radiating to chapels, towers, hilltops, as if the countryside had learned geometry while no one watched. Another bears seals whose flourishes promise dignity more than proof. Clippings are pasted with elderly glue, snips from regional histories, obituaries, notices of excavations where altar stones were moved, and opinions about saints were instructively revised. The pages practice good manners, even the hoaxes dress for dinner. Between dates and arrows, a boy appears, always at the needed moment. He is named Sigibert, fourth of that name, and he slips south like mist along the Aude, taking shelter among hills that hide Visigothic memories. The dossier lets him grow just enough to marry, to father, to rename, then disappears him into families where bees happen to decorate a crest, or lilies creep into the border of a seal. Coincidence is treated as choreography. Lists of grand masters lean across centuries like a bridge, untroubled by physics. Leonardo and Botticelli nod to Newton and a poet. The page asks you to imagine a society that kept art's pulse against history's throat, measuring both with courteous fingers. On another sheet, a priory appears, founding itself backward, depositing hints in archives, as if time were a well into which one could lower a message and hear it ring in the past. The room, aware of these bravura turns, remains calm. An archivist's pencil scratches a call number on a slip, and the graphite sound steadies the theater unfolding in our hands. There is something stern about the smell of paper and cloth glue. It reminds imagination that rules once existed, that someone bought stamps, that someone wrapped a parcel and walked it across a real city to a real counter where a clerk nodded. Fiction loves courtesies. Scholars will later do their patient work and show how the files were planted like bulbs, carefully, with the soil patted flat afterward, the gardener whistling an innocent tune. A modern organizer with a taste for noble aliases stood behind much of it, shaping stories that moved like fish when chased and froze like club mottos when mounted over mantels. In courtrooms and interviews, confessions blinked, then steadied, then blinked again. The record learned to carry both admission and charm. Yet even after such dusting, not everything becomes simple. A family cross, referenced by the papers, does own a grave one county over with a name inconveniently right. A charter misfiled in a parish trunk does repeat two syllables that belong to an older world. A chapel's orientation, by accident or saint's day, does greet a sunrise that rhymes with a line sketched in the dossier's margin. Truth likes to leave fingerprints at the edges of inventions, either to tease or to teach. Reread the Lobino map, and it performs a second act. The lines that once felt like declarations soften into possibilities. The geometry could be the countryside having its own reasons, or it could be human minds discovering pattern because pattern comforts the hour before sleep. It is possible both are true. Paths join towers because the ground between them is beautiful. Towers join stories because listeners are generous with meaning when the evening grows quiet. The tone of the documents is a seduction perfected by librarianship. Dates are poised. Citations court gently. Hand-drawn arrows recall a teacher's chalk. Even a photograph, grainy with the sincerity of its age, seems to nod. The collection asks to be believed not with bangles, but with balance. It offers itself as the one room in which the Merovingian thread never breaks, in which Saint-Denis and Stenay are not a quarrel, but a harmony humming quietly under paper. In our hands, the paper is both soft and stubborn. Turn a page and a watermark appears against the lamp, a faint emblem that pretends to be older than its ink. A note in the margin, 2 words perhaps, or an underlined date slips persuasion in like a finger closing a door. Photocopies repeat the air of authority 1 generation later, their darker gray whispering that originals exist, and that someone, somewhere, handles them with gloves and breath held. What interests more than credulity is the emotion these folders organize. They gather doubt, hope, complaint, and grief at the ravines in early medieval record and lay a plank across. It may not bear the weight of certainty, but it bears the weight of wondering beautifully. The plank becomes a bridge many cross at dusk, pausing midway to watch water think its long thoughts. No one falls. The river accepts the company, and always the little heir, the child who steps out of ambush and into inheritance, then falls back like a deer into scrub, leaving only a flash of color. He is the dossier's favorite miracle, the hinge on which a dozen corridors open, Scion, Templars, codes embedded in stations of the cross, hilltop triangles that rehearse constellations, bees repeating an alphabet around a name. If he lived, records forgot to shout. If he did not, the page loved him into a very durable maybe. The reading room's hum slows with late afternoon. Chairs produce their tiny throat-clearing sounds as bodies shift. A pencil falls and rolls like a small log. Someone stamps a slip, and the ink's dampness lifts a sweet smell that remembers wooden drawers and orderly minds. We close the folder and hold it a moment longer than necessary, as people hold letters after the news inside has done all the work it can do. When the cart comes to take the files back to their shelf, we feel how systems protect even their mistakes, as beehives feed a queen who has only partly earned her royal pantry. The hive survives because the pattern survives. The pattern survives because thousands of tiny decisions choose center over drift. These dossiers, sincere imposters, were adopted by the archive for the oldest of reasons. They arrived neatly labeled and asked for a home without shouting. Outside, dusk collects in the courtyard like spare ink, and a map in our mind keeps its glow. It shows hills where paper sends us and stone will answer differently. It shows a name that pretends to be an institution, Priory of Sion, standing at the ridge like a house with its shutters open, inviting a visit while disavowing ownership of any property at all. Paper, it seems, can build doors that lead to paths. We return our gloves to the box, sign a line, and feel the room's air resume without us. In the stairwell, the light is high and blue. It slides down stone, as if remembering rivers we have already walked. The city answers with its own hum: tram wires, cafe glassware, a motorcycle stitching dusk to night. We follow the dossier's last arrow out past the library's doors and into streets that lean south toward hills, and a story about a society that likely wasn't, yet refuses, even politely, to go away. The map from the dossiers glows faintly in the mind as dusk settles over the city. Lines run like threads from hill to chapel, from tower to stream, as if the countryside itself had practiced calligraphy. Somewhere along the margin a name waits, with the calm of a sign above a shuttered shop. Priory of Sion. The syllables feel older than they are, which is part of their craft. They arrive like a rumor wearing a borrowed coat. Begin with the plainest room. In 1956, in a small town at the foot of the Alps, papers were filed for an association using that name. The purpose, stated without flourish, concerned housing and civic matters. The members were few. One bore a fondness for noble aliases and for stories that grazed the borders of heraldry. The club existed. The centuries it claimed did not. Yet the title, beautifully weighted, immediately began to drift beyond its paperwork. A decade later, the archives in Paris received neat parcels whose contents pretended to remember more than any memory should. There were lists of grand masters, remarkable for their brilliance and their mutual unfamiliarity, artists who taught stone to sing, a mathematician who taught falling apples to think, a poet who taught language to blush. The line was not a rope so much as a necklace, heavy with names that catch the light. The clasp was the priory that claimed to wear them. People who loved order found the documents delicious. Dates curled obediently into place. Margins behaved. Even the handwriting had the cleanliness of a shirt ironed by someone who believes in collars. When a photograph appeared, grainy and earnest, it felt like a friend's elbow on the table, leaning in to lower the voice. Maps traced triangles between chapels with the confidence of a geometry lesson that had never once met a stubborn landscape. Then scholars stepped through the door and brought with them the weather of verification. This name was traced to that address, that signature to this living hand, this found document to a printing house that remembered the invoice and the week. Confessions emerged with the awkward charm of men who peek at theater, not at truth. The Grand Society dissolved back into the modest club it had been, and the papers learned to live on shelves marked with the careful word fabricated. And yet, a good fiction, like a candle, lights more than the wick it burns. The name did not vanish with the verdict. It became a bell that called different kinds of listeners to the same evening. Historians came to scold lovingly and to correct with patience. Tourists came to bring sandwiches and curiosity. Pilgrims came to rest a moment and tidy their doubts. The priory that likely wasn't became a stage on which many real questions rehearsed. Consider what the story accomplished, whether or not it earned the right. It gathered a dynasty with uncut hair, a missing tomb, a saint king venerated in a small town, a chamber rumored under stone, insects recovered from an ancient grave, and sewed them into a quilt that felt warm across the knees of late-night reading. The stitching was not always sound, but the pattern soothed. People who might otherwise have slept listened instead. There is a softer truth tucked inside the harder one. Myths, once named, behave like hives. Workers gather to build meaning cell by cell, some carrying pollen from scholarship, some carrying pollen from local talk, some bringing only the stamina of attention. Sweetness accumulates that no single bee could have made. When winter comes, when corrections arrive, when hoaxes are confessed, the hive does not die. It hums with the work of rearranging what remains. Walk out into the evening streets and listen. The tram wires hum with a note that is practical, not romantic, yet it rhymes with the crypt's low music and the archive's radiator breath. A symbol that does not exist can still make a city sing in one key. Books open, tours form, small economies wake and comb their hair. At cafes, maps unfold over cups that leave rings like eclipses. The priory's name hovers above these conversations the way a lamp's halo hovers above a table. Not the meal, but part of the eating. It helps to keep two companions on either side. On the left, the caution that refuses to grant a medieval charter to a 20th century club. On the right, the generosity that recognizes how a mistaken door can still lead to a worthwhile room. Between them, the walker keeps a slow, sane pace. He sees where the falseness lies, but he notices also how the false thing pointed like a choreographed finger toward artifacts and archives already there, merely waiting to be dusted and adored. In this median hour, even the list of grand masters returns with less arrogance. It looks less like a roster and more like a chorus gathered by accident. A painter who loved shadows, a dreamer who counted planets, a poet who kept bees in language. The list becomes a wish for civilization to be secretly organized by its tenderest guardians, not by force but by insistence, by the hum that outlasts a season. Wish is not history, but it is a human temperature that keeps the house from freezing. There are rooms where the priory turns from institution to instrument. In one, a librarian's hand labels a drawer for the first time with a Merovingian name, and thereby creates a doorway for future questions. In another, a parish in the south receives visitors and discovers it can repair a roof no one had money to repair before. In a third, a scholar uses annoyance like a compass, allowing exasperation to point toward primary sources that would have slept longer without the irritant. The myth also trained eyes to look again at symbols that survive without permission. Bees appear on lappets and lids. Lilies lean into stonework known for other meanings. Hair reappears in sculpture where no throne intrudes. A tenderness granted to saints and sorrowing mothers as much as to kings. People begin to read the landscape as if it were written, and the written page as if it grew, and the two ways of reading exchange courtesies that neither one invented alone. Does this excuse the planting of papers? It does not. It explains the harvest. The better gardens of the mind now post signs along their paths. Sources here, conjecture there, festival beyond this hedge. But the garden remains open at dusk, because dusk is a good hour for thinking kindly about the past. The priory sign hangs at the gate as a souvenir from a fair that has closed. Its letters have weathered into a softness the eye forgives. In the distance, a river begins to speak up again. Thread of water reminding us that all our pages are at best rafts. It draws the city southward in imagination, toward hills where Roman roads learn to wander, and where Visigothic stones sit under time, waiting for fingers to find their edges. The dossiers pointed that way. The legend points that way. Older paths point that way, whether or not paper encouraged them. The current does not argue. It receives and it delivers. And there, in the river mist, the figure we have felt moving along the margin returns. The child who leaves the page at the right instant and grows a life in valleys where records forget how to shout. He is the pleasant heresy the priory loved most, a possibility walking on 2 feet, implied by toponyms and by the stubbornness of certain names to die. Whether he existed or not, the tale of him has learned to breathe on its own. Night lifts a gentle wind along the boulevards. It plays with hair and with the steam fluttering above cups held in patient hands. Street lights comb their gold into the leaves, and the leaves remember they were once emblems before they were chores for sweepers. We fold the map the way a mother folds a scarf, careful not to wrinkle a corner that has learned our touch. The tram's hum thins, the lamps lower their lids, and the city turns its face toward the hills. Follow the river south. It will carry us into country where chapels sit like commas in a long sentence, where towers step from ridge to ridge as if rehearsing constellations, where mist in the Aude Valley rises early and leaves late. There, if the legend wishes to live anywhere at all, a boy might have learned to be a man without a crown's permission. The night air smells faintly of thyme and stone. The water sounds like a page turning. The river that tugged us out of Paris and down through fields takes on a new grammar here in the south, where the hills of the Aude lean together like listeners. Dawn travels slowly along the terraces, touching thyme, broom, and the pale bones of limestone where vines cling like careful handwriting. Roads forget to be straight. They choose older instincts, veering towards springs, chapels, and the shadow of watchtowers that learned their vigilance from stars. Along these bends survives a rumor with the elasticity of breath that a child once came this way, tender as a seed in a traveler's palm. The tale does not enter the world with trumpets. It arrives by mule track and hearth talk, a modest procession of names and gestures that fit inside a pocket. Sigibert, a name carried like a folded letter. Guardians who knew the skill of being uninteresting. A household that opened its door as a candle opens its circle. Simply, without boasting. No record shouts his passing. The charters of the age are busy with fields and obligations. The annals keep their attention north where crowns are exchanged, and hair learns humility. If a boy descended from a murdered king crossed these ridges, parchment either did not see or did not choose to say. The silence is not proof, only weather. In early medieval air, many feet passed and left no ink behind, while others, less urgent, learned to shine because a clerk liked their sound. Local stones keep different habits. In a churchyard, a baptismal slab lies face up, the letters softened into something like moss, yet the name on it refuses to vanish entirely. In another village, a lintel bears a pair of carved bees crowded by leaves, old enough to be convincing, ambiguous enough to admit cicadas too. A path name repeats an ancient syllable in the way valleys echo, imperfectly but insistently, as if the land itself enjoyed keeping a refrain. Guides and small museums tell the story with a politeness that does not insist. A boy arrives under the care of those who remember the North with a mixture of love and careful fear. He learns to listen more than speak. He is taught fields, prayers, and the foreign competence of not attracting notice. Adults stand where maps cannot see them and make a life with the simple tools given them by time, labor, marriage, the discipline of becoming ordinary. A name can be a cloak, and the South owned many good ones. Families folded syllables like bread into their company. Some names thickened, others thinned. The child's name, if child there was, learns to live in echoes. Sig, sieg. Sometimes sinking into the local water like a pebble, and surfacing as a ripple of sound near market stones. This is not proof. Only the sympathy language shows to its own past when left alone long enough to miss it. The valleys here keep chronicles in shade and wind. Terraces remember hands more than signatures. A vaulted cellar, damp with the breath of centuries, stores more than wine. Here rest the habits that let a story pass from one generation to another without ever stepping fully into law. A mother tells a child not to play under the tower because stones fall there. A grandfather lifts a finger and says the family came from farther than the next hill. A priest initials a register with a flourish that seems, to eyes alert for pattern, excessive for a Tuesday. On certain feast mornings, the sun rises along a line past a chapel and a ruined donjon, a geometry so elegant that it begs for meaning. Perhaps it is accident. Perhaps the builders loved the same horizon for the same human reasons. Perhaps festivals and light arranged a dance as old as sewing. The boy of rumor lives under that light. He learns which olives to pick first and which neighbors will share water in August. When the wind is kind, bees join the olives and teach him that sweetness prefers order to spectacle. If you ask for documents, the room answers with courteous shrugs. There are registers, yes, and they carry names you could stack into a tree until the branches complained. but none of the pages will step forward and declare, without stammer, that a prince learned to be a farmer here, or a steward, or a man who grew a family like a careful vineyard. The South is sparing with declarations. It prefers straightforward tasks, pruning, repairing, teaching children where to step on steep paths, and yet the idea refuses to leave because it solves a feeling left over from the North, that a line cut at the trunk might still send a green shoot under the fence and find the sun on the other side. It is not that blood proves anything. It is that continuity, even imagined kindly, helps evening settle. People bend to the story as to a chore they enjoy. Not necessary, perhaps, but satisfying in its rhythm. If an heir survived, history did not invite him to sit at tables where coins argue. He sat elsewhere, where bread and oil are still an evening's finest conversation. There are households here whose symbols acquire a patient glow when looked at through the dossier's glass. A signet with a lily that could as easily be an iris, a bee engraved small enough to be mistake or mischief, a motto that remembers Latin the way a widow remembers a tune. Most of it, but softly. It is easy to overread, and just as easy to shrug and feel nothing. Between these postures, the tale builds a room and sets before us bread dusted lightly with flour, expecting nothing but an appetite for companionship. Paths south of Carcassonne keep the shape of older roads. The Roman habit remains in their bones, even when sheep have reclaimed the surfaces. Underfoot, grit speaks softly of years when legions made time into distance and distance into rule. Later people learned the same tricks for gentler reasons: trade, pilgrimage, the steady river of work. The boy becomes a man somewhere on these tracks, or he doesn't. The point is not his certainty, but the tenderness with which this country receives strangers who will become native by the second harvest. Stand on a ridge at dusk, and the land offers its usual wisdom, which is not ours, but shares a language with it. Below, a village needs light into its windows. A square keeps a promise of music that may or may not appear after the plates are cleared. To the west, a tower breaks the sky like a bookmark. In that place and hour, the mind believes easily in transformations that require no miracles, danger becoming distance, inheritance becoming task, a bright name becoming the comfortable shadow of a porch. Winter arrives with a brief discipline. Snow shows the lines of paths that summer hides in generosity. A new baby is baptized by a priest with brown hands and a habit of smiling before he speaks. He writes the chosen name with a flourish the family will admire for decades, and the ink steeps into paper like tea into linen. On the way home, the father carries the child in his arms. The mother walks a step ahead as wind works her hair free of its ribbon and gives it back without argument. Some say the boy of rumor married into a house that could carry him invisibly through time. They say his children learned field names as if they were saints' names, and that one of them had a way with beehives that spared him stings others endured. They say, in the private theater of evenings, that a few syllables were guarded the way seeds are kept in an earthen jar against years of lean. They say more than they can prove, and less than they feel. The land does not correct them. It keeps harvesting. What matters for our quiet journey is how such a story bends the eye toward a hilltop that will become unavoidable. The map we carry, the one the dossiers sketched, and the one the river suggests without ink, draws us to a village, lifted into air, as if to keep secrets from damp. People will later come for its priest and his inexplicable funds, for his taste in paint and puzzles, for stations that seem to argue with themselves. But before that, there is only the road wrapping the hill like a thoughtful arm. Evening collects along the Aude, a silver ribbon sliding under bridges that misremember the Romans kindly. Bees grow drowsy in their orderly rooms. Smoke rises from kitchen chimneys, learning to write the same sentence it wrote last year and the year before. We follow the last switchback up, past rosemary growing like a rumor proper to stone, past a doorway whose lintel bears an old, tired lily. At the crest, a small church waits with its door closed, the way eyelids close, ready to open at a touch. Pause here. The wind carries a hint of wax and old varnish, the perfume of rooms that keep their voices low. A coin taps the bottom of a poor box and learns the sound of wood. Somewhere within, a pair of hands will spread plans over a table, choosing colors and angels as if choices were prayers. The river below will continue thinking in silver. The bees will find sleep, and we step over the threshold toward a priest whose fortune has been waiting its turn in our story, patient as a candle that knows how to last the night. The hill rises like a folded palm above the Aude, fingers of limestone cupping a village that has learned to keep its voice low. At the top, narrow lanes drift toward a small church whose door remembers many different weathered hands. Rosemary leans out of garden walls. Shutters blink like slow eyelids in the afternoon wind. From below, the river sends up a silver rumor. From above, bells answer with one careful note, and then silence. Into this stillness, in 1885, came a parish priest with a quick stride and a taste for mended things. Bérenger Saunière inherited a church that needed patience more than sermons. Broken steps, a damp apse, paint that had oxidized into the color of old coins. He began as many careful men begin, by making an inventory with his eyes and his hands. Then he set about raising the house of worship from its long slumber with the plain grace of repairs. The first work touched stone. Altars were moved, flooring lifted. A pillar near the sanctuary was pried open to accept reinforcement. Workmen murmured at the oddities that old churches often hide: reused capitals, bricks tattooed with earlier centuries, small cavities where time had gone to ground. Later stories would give these cavities contents, parchments perhaps, or lists written in a steady hand. But the only certain thing is that the walls yielded to tools and the priest's habit of attention. Soon the pace of change startled neighbors. New statues arrived wrapped in straw. A bell found its confident tongue. Paint bloomed where damp had grazed the arches thin. In the little ledger where expenses should have learned modesty, numbers stretched as if the paper had become elastic. Some said a patron's purse had opened. Some said multiple small gifts had learned to sing as a choir. Some said the hill itself had remembered a debt and paid it, with interest, in coin. The hilltop acquired silhouettes no one expected. On one shoulder rose a square tower called Magdala, crisp as a page corner against the sky, its lookout balcony reading the horizon the way a scholar reads a line twice, to be sure. Below it, a handsome villa called Bethania grew with a confidence that seemed unusual for a parish this small. Broad steps, bright windows, a veranda where afternoon light lined the floor in gold. Between tower and house, bees stitched the garden into hum. Mail began to find the priest as if he were a crossroads. Bundles of envelopes arrived, foreign stamps crowding their corners like small parades. He wrote back steadily. The postmistress could measure his correspondence by how the drawer with blue stamps emptied and filled. Talk drifted down the lanes about stipends for masses, intentions offered from far cities, coins folded with folded prayers. The sums multiplied, took on a life of their own, and the bishop's office, patient by nature, grew cautious. Investigations come to parishes the way weather comes to fields. The diocese asked for ledgers. The ledgers answered with arithmetic that satisfied no one completely. Was the priest multiplying intentions beyond what one pair of hands could honor at the altar? Were other gifts traveling in private channels? A suspension arrived like a draft under a door, and for a time Saunière said Mass, where he could, and lived by his wits, while appeals inched across the bureaucratic sky. Through it all, his housekeeper moved like a quiet clock in the same rooms. Marie Denarnaud kept accounts and recipes in silence, a domestic trinity that endures when newspapers forget to be curious. Neighbors saw her arm in his as they walked the hill paths at evening, stopping where the view instructed the mind to behave. Years later, she would inherit the properties and the questions. Years later still, she would die with more of both than she had managed to spend. Inside the church, the changes grew bolder and stranger. Statues arrived from a Toulouse workshop, painted with a brightness that felt new under the old vaulting. By the door, a devil crouched beneath a holy water stoup, holding obedience in grotesque hands, while visitors crossed themselves above his bent head. Along the arch, a line from Scripture declared, "Terribilis est locus iste," a sentence as flexible as bone, terrible as in awesome, as in set apart, as in a place where meanings multiply and select. This was, after all, the Church of Mary Magdalene, and her story braided penance with witness in a way the countryside understood. The decor tilted toward her with a confidence not everyone shared, but the painter's brush cared more for color than argument. In niches, angels watched with polite faces, as if they knew additional work would be asked of them. To keep a secret, perhaps, or to misdirect the curious by looking more emphatic than they felt. The tower, Tour Magdala, acquired a library and a balcony, two instruments for the same pastime, looking. A man could step from spines to skyline in one motion, carrying in his hands a book and in his eyes a compass the land itself provided. From there the view collated chapels and hilltops into shapes that tempted drawing. Triangles rehearsed themselves between stone and stone, as if the horizon wished to imitate the star maps rolled in a drawer nearby. Visitors came, and rumors kept careful pace. Some evenings the priest was seen walking with a lantern to a fold in the hill. Some afternoons he was seen chalking marks no one could parse, and erasing them before dusk bothered to ask. He hosted with courtesy when he had to, and declined with equal courtesy when he did not. He preferred decisions made in the company of bees and rosemary, where sentences did not echo. The little ledgers, when opened, did not confess more than they had to. They contained flour and candles, paints and statuary, postage in loyal profusion, transfers that swam back and forth between accounts like fish, the same color as water. A banker's stamp appeared often enough to be a subplot. Occasionally a payment was attributed to benefactors, plural, as if generosity had requested anonymity rather than applause. The entries closed for the day with the prim confidence only ink enjoys. What did he say when pressed? People remember him refusing to turn his life into a scandal or an apology. Illness found him in 1917. A stroke or weakness slowed his mouth, and he is said to have whispered a sentence about a secret too large for belief. Perhaps he did. Perhaps the village put words to a silence in order to be consoled. He died with the tower and villa standing, with accounts that argued and refused to conclude, and with an altar that shone like a new thought. Marie kept the keys. In years lean and years forgetting, she let visitors see a little, and then withdrew the tour like a hand from cool water. A sale almost happened, then did not. A promise was nearly spoken, then changed its mind. Time gathered dust where labels might have been, and drawers learned patience from their own stubborn runners. The house lived on bread and stories until the latter grew stronger. The church itself, finished and unfinishable, remained the best witness. Its paint held the air of a stage set after the audience is gone, each prop sure of its place, each color confident it knows what to say even if no one asks. The font by the demon's hands kept blessing. The arch kept declaring its terribleness in the older sense. The Magdalene kept her gaze arranged as if she knew her part in a larger composition. If you stood long in that nave, you felt not an answer, but a choreography. Eyes led to hands, hands to tablets, tablets to inscriptions, inscriptions to small errors that might be accidents or arrows. A skull appeared where you did not expect it. A gesture inverted the usual logic of a biblical scene. A garment borrowed the wrong century's fold. The program was subtle and steady. Someone had tuned the room to play a second melody beneath the first. Evening comes early on that hill. The tower gathers the last light and returns it to the valley in thin copper spills. Bees lodge for the night. The river takes on a pewter tone. Rosemary forgets to be fragrant until the next warm noon. The door of the church closes with a soft amen. Inside, the Stations of the Cross wait the way letters wait in a box, patient, sealed, ready to show their order to anyone who reads slowly. Tomorrow we will read them, not to catch the painter in a trick, but to hear what the pictures murmur when the nave learns to whisper. Night gathers inside the little church, the way ink gathers in the downstroke of a pen. Slow, deliberate, final for now. A keeper turns the key and leaves, and the nave keeps breathing on its own. Candles loosen their shoulders. Colors sink one shade deeper. The demon beneath the holy water stoop squats in patient service, a carved reminder that even misrule can be made to hold something clean. In that softened light, the Stations of the Cross look less like pictures than like sentences. They were purchased, the locals say, from a workshop in Toulouse, discreetly grand for a hilltop that counts its coins with care. Frames glint in respectful gold. Figures lean toward grief, as the story requires. Yet the sequence seems to hear a different metronome. The first station behaves more or less. Jesus is condemned. Robes and pillars do their work. But as you move along the walls, a minor key begins to insist. Gestures tilt. A glance lands somewhere it usually doesn't. A skull appears where a skull rarely does. Not at the Hill of Bones, but in a lane that cannot reasonably claim the charter of Golgotha. A soldier's hand points not at Christ, but past him, toward a corner where the plaster has aged into a color that knows how to keep its secrets. a woman's veil folds into a shape that resembles a letter more than fabric. None of this proves anything, and all of it remembers something. The knave accepts both attitudes without complaint. On another panel, the cross lies at an angle that asks to be measured. Compass, protractor. The teacher's chalk that once mapped triangles in a bright schoolroom, airing out the smell of ink. The angle repeats later in the sequence with a stubbornness that might be chance or choreography. The mind draws a line from that angle to the tower outside, and from the tower to a ruined donjon on a sister hill, and from the donjon back through the door to the picture's edge where the brush lifted. Colors speak their own dialect. A robe meant for sorrow burns with a Marian blue too hopeful for the hour. Elsewhere, a mantle red, as a seal's wax, implies regal presence, where the text only asks for a passerby. Someone decided that hues should carry a second task under the first, liturgy layered beneath narrative, or perhaps merely a painter's pleasure in the way blue leans against gold, like night against lamplight. If there is a code, it prefers the body's response to the mind's mathematics. Lettering on small scrolls and labels behaves politely until it doesn't. A capital leans, as if nudged by a thumb. A letter that should have been ordinary is crowned with a flick the brush had no business bestowing. The Latin, perfectly adequate for parish purposes, includes a spacing that invites suspicion and also invites mercy. Type is tidy. Paint breathes. A mislaid serif can be accident, or it can be a bee's wing tucked on a margin for those who have learned to watch for pollen. One station invites the eye to follow a hand, not the sacred hand which blesses, but the bystander's, which seems almost to trace a line across the panel, through the wood, and into the wall itself. If you obey the invitation, your gaze runs along the nave's length to a statue that looks elsewhere. At its base, an ornament repeats a hexagon until it forgets to be decorative and begins to be architectural. Bees again, or the ghost of a comb under varnish. Meaning or echo, the room allows both readings to rest. The Magdalene, to whom the church belongs, glows as if her pigments had been mixed with longer patience than the others received. In one station her eyes tilt not up, not down, but sideways, toward a place in the building the tourist map does not mark. Her hair, more river than veil, carries its own liturgy, uncut, unshamed, a countertext to kings whose power once grew from strands and fell with shears. Here hair is absolution, not authority, or perhaps absolution is the only authority that survives renovation. Even the floor collaborates. Tiles in sober colors make tessellations that can be crossed in thought and then in footstep, from a square to a cross, to a star, and back again. The pattern repeats and refuses to be merely pattern, especially if one has recently visited the library and allowed a certain dossier to press its geometry into the mind. Stand at the baptistry, look along the aisle, and a path appears that did not exist a moment before. Whether the priest meant you to see it is between you and the patient demon by the door. Stories accrete to these anomalies, like dew to rosemary. A visitor swears he found a letter hidden in the hem of a painted robe. A skeptic answers that hems behave like shapes when the brush runs out of breath. Someone insists a station was once hung out of order and then restored. Someone else has a postcard that argues the opposite. A mason points out a hairline crack that falls exactly where a line on an old map would demand it, then laughs at himself and asks whether maps deserve that much loyalty. What no one contests is the vigor of Saunier's choices. He could have ordered the meekest style from the catalogue and earned the parish's gratitude without a single rumor to feed. Instead, he curated drama, a demon supporting sacred water, a Latin verse that calls the place terrible in the older sense, as if replaced by a word the century no longer remembers how to hold, stations that keep their story and borrow a whisper from elsewhere. Whether these acts arise from piety, play, or something with a pocket of coin behind it, the walls keep the confidence they were given. At midday, the church behaves like any other. Knees on wood, matches struck, the quiet inventory of ordinary grief. But in the hour when the nave empties and the light grays, the pictures step forward a half-inch and confess that they like being looked at by minds that welcome pattern and prefer kindness to proof. They do not deny the possibility of codes. They do not grant it jurisdiction. They smile, a little, with the same mouth saints use when they remember they were once simply people who had to make rent. Outside on the balcony of the Magdala Tower, the horizon does what the pictures only suggest. It draws lines between high points. Chapels blink in the late sun. A tower on a far ridge gives one bright answer, and then resumes its stone silence. Between them run the thoughts of those who walked before us, the Templars with their ledgers and vows, the stewards with their calendars and roads. Triangles discover themselves without help, as if the land had always intended to rehearse the sky. It is possible to be unfair to paintings by treating them as locks that must admit keys. It is kinder, perhaps truer, to treat them as windows, some thrown open for air, some latched, each framing a slice of a world that has already decided what it will reveal. A reverse gesture may be a workshop habit, a miscolored robe, a missing pigment, a skull, a sculptor's enthusiasm for memento mori on any day of the week. And yet the cumulative effect is stubborn. The room hums. Bees are not present, and still the air learns their note. Dusk thickens. Candles gain confidence. The panels resume their official duties as guidebooks for prayer, and whatever second music they make lowers itself to a lull. We step back onto the terrace where the tower keeps watch, and the Aude Valley folds into blues that promise sleep. Somewhere a horse lifts a hoof and sets it down again, a single syllable of a longer tale. The lines we saw inside, angles, glances, hexagons, find their echoes in ridge lines and paths that go where stones and vows once led. Follow those lines beyond the hill into cooler air where knights learn to keep a secret by walking it. From the tower's balcony, the hills arrange themselves like pages left open to the wind, and certain crests begin to rhyme. Chapels blink to one another across folds of time. A ruined donjon holds its angle like a compass point. Paths descend, cross a river that remembers Rome, and rise again toward plateaus where wheat stands in mild ranks. It is easy up here to believe that thought can walk from stone to stone without getting lost. People say the Knights Templar learned these roots the way bees learn air, by flying them so often that the landscape itself began to hum. Their houses, called commanderies and preceptories, studded the countryside from the Aude to the Rhone, each a modest hive with stores, stables, a chapel, and a yard where hooves beat time. Far away their order had been born beside a different hill, on ground sacred to more than one story, and sent back to Europe with a purpose that loved roads. What is certain is simple and already soothing. A brotherhood founded in the 12th century, pledged to poverty and arms, endorsed by sermons that turned courage into liturgy and logistics into charity. They guarded pilgrims and kept the peace when coins forgot their manners. Their privileges grew, their barns filled, their ledgers learned to sing in numbers, and a map of Europe developed a quiet constellation of places where a traveler might find bread, a bed, and news that had feet. In Languedoc the constellation brightened. Trade liked these valleys. So did ideas. The order acquired farms and way stations, mills where water turned thought into flour, vineyards where the year could be read in barrels instead of texts. A brother in a white cloak, red cross stitched with a needle that also knew how to mend, could leave one commandery after lauds and be received at another by vespers without pressing his horse. The distance between decency and danger shrank to something bearable. Stand a map upright to the light, and certain lines step forward as if ink had dried there when no one was watching. From a chapel dedicated to Mary Magdalene, draw a thread to a tower on an opposite ridge. From there to a wayside cross near an old mill. From the cross to a church that keeps bees in its eaves. The triangle closes with a tidiness that tempts belief. Another day, at sunrise on the Magdalene's feast, a pale blade of light appears to run along that same thread. A farmer in a nearby village swears his grandfather taught him that 3 commandery wells, if visited in order before noon, never returned a bucket empty. A school teacher, careful with maps and sunlight, marks feast days and returns home with sunburn and a notebook full of angles that repeat themselves more than chance would like. A baker, sweeping flour from his bench, draws the lines with a finger and says it looks like the pattern used to score loaves before the oven makes them honest. Skeptics answer with kindness and gravel. Valleys dictate where men build. Crests dictate where they watch. Water dictates everything that lives. Put enough chapels on enough hills, and triangles will bloom like clover, even if no hand designed a garden. Feast day sunrises arrive somewhere every day they are asked, and the earth is generous with right angles if you squint. People are good at finding nets in clouds. The Templars, good accountants, probably built where fields cooperated and left poetry to saints. Yet the poetry persists because some stones seem to prefer conversation. A lintel carved with a cross pate looks east in the same manner as a roadside oratory 3 miles away. A wayside marker bears a shallow hexagon worn exactly where a hand would rest when the path climbs too steeply. In a wall that knows how to keep secrets, a reused block keeps a faint crest. Not a lily, not quite, but a petal's geometry practicing to be one. The land learns a vocabulary from its tenants. There is also the matter of letters that travel without paper. The order pioneered receipts that could be redeemed at distance. The pilgrim's purse, transformed into script carried safely in the sleeve, cached behind quiet doors. Coin walked the land when paper learned to ride. Between house and house, a brother's oath filled the space that robbers found hard to enter. Logistics became a religion of trust. The roots themselves became psalms, taught by rote, and passed down through hooves and habit. Where roots repeat, meaning accumulates the way silt does. A chapel placed for convenience becomes a station placed for intention. A mill that pays rent in flour becomes a mark that links two peaks as if the hills had been consulted. The mind, standing again on the balcony, sees how the grid might carry more than grain. What if the lines were not only for wagons, but also for names? Corridors along which a particular syllable could move from century to century without losing its breath. A rumor joins the conversation, walking on soft boots, that among the chests moved from coast to coast, from port to preceptory and back again. There traveled boxes that contained only parchment and a length of folded cloth. Not gold, not relics that could be counted, but lists, people and places written in a hand that had learned to keep quills sharp. The treasure, in this telling, is a memory with addresses. Only those who knew the roads could keep such a thing safe for long. One commandery's chapel shows a window whose glass spells a story in sable bees and pale lilies, a combination explained by donations if one asks the parish book, by ancestry if one asks the old man who lights candles. Another preceptory's courtyard preserves a stone whose wear suggests 1,000 quiet turns of a key. The order loved keys. They liked doors that opened briskly and closed politely, papers that unfolded without tearing, and vaults that remembered the weight of promises better than voices did. Of course, the order also learned to be feared. Wealth draws weather. Credit makes enemies who prefer coin. Kings and ministers, impatient with institutions that collect dues without kneeling, invented a dawn that arrived with shackles. In a single October morning across France, men who knew roads were helped none by distance. The net cast inward and caught almost all. Trials adorned paperwork with dread. A few years later, a bull finished the work, and the map sighed. Certain houses went quiet forever. The lines, however, did not forget themselves. Farms were sold or folded into other estates. Chapels were rededicated. Stones were reused where barns needed corners. But if you go out at daybreak and stand where three paths meet, you can still feel how travel prefers pattern. Bees fly the same lanes their predecessors sketched in air. Shepherds remember gates that no longer exist and take their flocks through the absence without complaint. The landscape keeps an after-image of a grid, like a watermark in light. Perhaps the triangles and sunrise angles are nothing but the mercy of geometry on minds that want company. Perhaps the order drew only ledgers and not constellations. Perhaps the only thing they guarded was the habit of keeping oaths when weather turned and governments changed their minds. Or perhaps the grid carried a quieter freight, the continuity of names and the secrecy that lets names live where crowns cannot. A comb without honey still has beauty. A key without a door still promises order. Evening breathes cool across the balcony. The tower's stones remember footsteps that took measure without boasting. In the valley, small lights gather where kitchens explain the day to themselves. Somewhere in a field, a horse shakes off flies and redraws a line in dust. We fold the imagined map and slip it into the pocket where harmless hopes are kept. Ahead, a door waits that was built with economy, thick and undecorated. Listen, a ring of keys lifts and answers gravity. We will follow that sound into a room where locks open not onto gold, but onto parchment and the dust of old oaths, and see gently what the knights truly kept. Keys ring once in a dark corridor, and the sound, small, exact, opens a room shaped for custody. Stone walls keep their cool even in late summer, Iron brackets hold lamps that prefer steadiness to drama. On tables, chests wait with the patience of oxen. The lids are strapped, banded, clever with hidden pins. If there is treasure, it does not ask to glitter. It asks to be counted. The order learned early that safety prefers routine. Brothers rose at hours that taught the body obedience to bells. They prayed, rode, repaired tack, and kept ledgers with a thrift of ink. What knights kept most faithfully, the room suggests, was time. The measured day, the predictable season, the calendar you could ride by from one preceptory to the next, like stepping stones across a river. There are coins, yes, silver that once thought itself immortal, gold that remembered desert caravans, and seals that press authority into wax with the bite of an old tooth. But beside them lie objects that look almost embarrassed to be here. Bundles of folded parchment, strings of tallies, a small bag that the inventory calls reliquary, without saying what warmth it carried. A keyring hangs on a nail with the humility of a servant who understands everything. The order's privileges made rooms like this possible. A vow, a rule, and the favor of high altars allowed brothers to cross borders that would have troubled merchants. Letters of credit, written in compact hands, turned distance into trust. A pilgrim could pay in one city and receive his purse, intact in value, in another. Nothing to rob between, nothing to clatter in saddlebags, only a folded script under a cloak and the confidence of a seal. Such paper multiplied. Receipts and quittances, inventories after harvest, notes of rents paid in grain, in oil, in wax, the color of dusk. A clerk's marks, little crosses, ticks, circles, read like a quiet music for those who knew the tune. When danger rose, the order moved memory as quickly as coin. Some chests traveled with guards. Some were hidden in plain rooms where dust disguised importance better than stone. Rumor adds its own cargo. It says at least one chest held no metal at all, only a length of cloth folded like a map and a list of names, families, and places written in a hand that made promises without a trumpet. If such a chest existed, it would be kept here, between the useful and the holy, in a room that teaches the difference only to those who live with both. Rumor does not insist. It never had to. Elsewhere in the house, a small chapel keeps the order's other discipline. Light strikes the wall, and a red cross opens its arms with a confidence founded in repetition. Psalms run like water along the edges of duty. Prayers sheath the day like oil. Nights kept hours the way they kept roads. They were guardians of passage, of thresholds, river fords, mountain passes, and the unspectacular doorway between fear and arrival. What they kept then was not merely possession, but continuity. Wheat from tenants becomes bread in a refectory, becomes coin in a preceptory's small coffer, becomes fodder and lamp oil and charity down the road. The sequence is fragile without the habit that binds it. The order's genius was to make habit into shelter, shelter into promise. Trespassers could break into rooms. They struggled to break the rhythm. Symbols learned this rhythm too. A combed pattern in a lintel, hexagons around a seal, bees stitched small in glass, where morning stood politely and shone. The grammar repeats until it becomes environment. A lily curls on a tile, not to proclaim royalty, but to whisper that the house which placed it speaks that language when necessary. Stone absorbs alphabets without ever reading aloud. In the yard, hooves scuff dust. Brothers move with a purpose that sweeps rather than strides. One inspects locks, another oils a hinge, a third checks the grain bins and listens with his knuckles for hollowness where there should be weight. Keeping is an art of hands and ears. It values the sound of enough more than the spectacle of abundance. In years of lean weather, this art was a sacrament. But weather changes. A Friday in October taught the order what nets feel like from the inside. At dawn, doors opened not to prayer but to paper-bearing seals, not their own. The key rings behaved with their usual dignity. They were surrendered. The rooms let strangers breathe their air. Inventories were taken in voices that tried to sound impartial. In the quiet after footsteps, the walls learned a different echo. Dispersal followed. In many places, properties moved to another order with similar vows. In others, revenues were captured by crowns that had learned to covet as carefully as monks learned to copy. Brothers who kept locks learned how locks behave when turned from the other side. Some traveled. Some confessed to things worth tears and to things worth laughter. Some simply folded back into the world's anonymity, like rain into soil. Still, the old craft lingered. Roads do not forget the feet that taught them patience. Chapels kept their orientation even when their paint changed names. Farmers who had delivered tithes learned to deliver them elsewhere with the same cart and the same joke about mules disliking sermons. A comb stays a comb, whether or not honey fills it this year. Keeping is often a matter of remembering which drawer holds the candles when the storm takes the lamps. Return to the room of chests and see how ordinary it insists on being. Here is a ledger whose cover has forgotten its color. Here are seals with cords braided by hands that also mended bridles. Here is a key whose bit shows a tooth filed down, as if a door had forgiven a small misalignment for years. The room is not romantic, it is reliable. The romance came later, when absence taught listeners to gild silence. If a secret survived, it likely learned the order's own virtues. It would have traveled in company, not alone, folded in a letter that also mentions barley, placed between ordinary pages that invited no theft. It would have chosen roots that rain could not scold, roofs that mice respected, hands that preferred duties to stories. It would not have been the sort of secret that knocks chalices over. It would have been the kind that keeps names alive by using them carefully. Stand in the doorway. Light from the yard falls across the floor and breaks gently on the foot of a chest. Dust glows like a language the room speaks only when unobserved. Somewhere a small hive in the eaves argues with the hour, practicing the old arithmetic of flights and returns. The hum is not dramatic. It is foundational. Keeping, whether of bees or vows, sounds like this. The question we brought, what did the knights keep, answers itself slowly. They kept roots, keys, schedules, letters that turned danger into distance. They kept, at times, relics. At other times, the memory of where relics had been. They kept promises written and unwritten. Perhaps in a kinder telling, they also kept legitimacy for others, holding continuity in escrow until weather changed. When we leave, the keys ring again. Not an ending. More a punctuation, a careful writer favors. Outside, the yard returns to its chores, and the hills take back their quiet. The river below carries silt and rumor with the same even shoulder. What remains in the mind are not chests finally, but signs, The small bees in glass, the lily tucked into stone, the remembered weight of hair that once meant sovereignty. Symbols, unlike fortresses, can travel without carts. Follow them as they move into open air. See how a hexagon hides in a rosette, how a lily curls in a gutter spout, how a strand carved on a saint's brow remembers a law older than metal. The language of keeping has a script of its own, written across cloaks and tiles and coins. We will read that script next, gently, letting each emblem say only what it can bear. The hum will help us, and the wind, combing even the quiet grass, as if it still knows what hair means. Morning loosens the night from the eaves, and the first light discovers what stone has been practicing for centuries, speaking without a voice. Symbols wait where hands placed them long ago, carved on lintels, stitched into banners, pressed in wax, polished into coins. They do not argue, they endure. If you walk slowly enough, the countryside becomes a quiet primer, and each emblem offers a lesson in how power prefers to be remembered. Begin with bees. They rarely appear alone. One is a creature. Many are a language. In glass, on cloth, in metal, they teach the patience of pattern. Work repeated until sweetness arranges itself into order. Whether the small golden insects recovered from an ancient grave were bees or cicadas, people saw hives in them, not summers. The eye chose diligence over song, continuity over molt. Ever since, a line of tiny bodies has stood for the art of thriving together. Bees suit rule because their labor is both visible and modest. They fly straight. They return. They make winter survivable. A household that sews bees along a hem or hangs them in a border says, without saying, we will store, we will keep, we will distribute. Even in churches, their geometry hides in hexagons smoothed by blessing and fingers, a comb disguised as ornament. You can pass right by and miss them, which is sometimes what symbols desire. To work while your mind is elsewhere. The fleur-de-lis speaks differently, with petals held like a contained flame. It has been claimed by dynasties the way wells are claimed by villages. Once adopted, indispensable. On stone, the lily becomes architecture's punctuation mark, appearing at the end of a cornice as if to tell the line to breathe. On cloth, it multiplies like stars in a disciplined sky. The emblem does not need a crown near it to suggest that the room it adorns prefers order with a lineage. Look closely, and the lily's grammar changes with its setting. On a gutter spout, it is almost a joke, water wearing royalty as it leaves. On a seal, it is a contract, curling around names that hope to survive the tempers of kings. On a pilgrim badge bent by weather and pockets, it becomes portable reverence, half prayer, half souvenir. The same three petals, softly different, teach that power has registers and that memory is smart enough to speak in all of them. Hair, by contrast, is a symbol that refuses to be detached from breath. It lives and grows, resists tidy explanations, accepts wind as an equal. Once, the uncut head signaled sovereignty too intimate for metals to carry. To touch it was to trespass against an invisible law. Even after the shears learned to translate sacral power into sacrament, hair remained a script the body wrote every day, strand as sentence, braid as paragraph, tonsure as carefully chosen silence. The world keeps these three alphabets: bees for labor, lilies for pedigree, hair for consecrated flesh, and composes with them even when no one admits to writing. A chapel roof borrows the lily to say the parish belongs to a larger music. A city standard lifts bees to claim its market is honest, its warehouses trustworthy. A saint statue lets hair fall a little longer than the workshop manual prescribes. And the air around the niche thickens with a very old respect. Symbols migrate across the map the way families do, by marriage, by work, by weather. What begins on a royal mantle may end as a mason's flourish. What starts as a pilgrim's trinket may find itself on a ledger as a town's official mark. Along the way, meanings soften at the edges and grow kindly. Even quarrels over who first owned a sign quiet under the regular traffic of use. The lily does not ask for a birth certificate when it steadies a line of stone. It merely holds. We read too much, perhaps. We read too little, perhaps. Yet the sleep-friendly truth is that symbols earn their keep even when misunderstood. Bees, whether born in legend or field, continue to instruct the nervous system. Breathe like a hive in winter. Work like a hive in spring. Store what you can. Share what you must. Lilies counsel posture, how to stand without swagger, how to decorate without noise. Hair whispers that some forms of power should be worn, not wielded. Consider a street where history has layered itself sensibly. A doorway bears a lily above its arch. A shop sign shows a bee inside a circle of wheat. A relief sculpture on a corner saint repeats a pattern of waves that could be hair, could be wind, could be the way stone remembers water. Without asking permission, the symbols collaborate. A passerby feels steadier and cannot say why. The grammar has done its work, not speech, but syntax, not orders, but orientation. Coins repeat the lesson on a smaller stage. A tiny lily on a disk of silver behaves like a lighthouse for trust. A ring of bees around a date turns arithmetic into promise. A ruler's hair, carved where the die cutter had only the smallest space, becomes a rumor of legitimacy that jingles in every pocket. Money wanted to be metal. Symbols taught it to be memory. Long after regimes fall, a coin sleeps in a drawer and keeps its language warm. In churches, the collaboration deepens. Candles take hexagonal bites out of their own wax. Floor tiles learn lilies by habit. A reliquary uses hair to anchor a story that would otherwise float. Hymns rise and set down like bees, arriving and departing in good weather. Pilgrims do not always notice the emblems at their feet and above their heads, but their bodies do, and sleep that night comes easier, as if the day had spoken gently and in complete sentences. Of course, a grammar can be abused. A forged seal borrows a lily to make lies feel inevitable. A parade steals bees to disguise noise as work. A lock of hair cut without consent becomes a trophy. But misuse only proves the strength of the language. People learn to test, to ask where a sign belongs and whether it has earned its place. Symbols survive imposters, the way rivers survive boats that think they own the current. There are rooms where the three alphabets meet and agree to share custody of meaning. In one, a charter hangs with lilies along its border, while a wax seal molded like a hive stamps the bottom, and a strand of something, hair or thread, rests beneath the glass because someone once thought it safer there than in a drawer. The room does not shout, it hums. Visitors leave feeling that continuity has been honored without being bullied. Stand outdoors again and let the wind comb the grass. It moves like hair used to move on the brows of kings and saints and beggars, equal in caress, indifferent to rank. Bees thread the clover with the unconcern of experts doing what they were born to do. On a nearby gate, a lily has rusted into a brown ghost of itself, still legible, still apt. The afternoon teaches the only sermon worth repeating. Order should feel like relief, not restraint. At twilight, the grammar gathers into a single chord, the comb of cloud, the petal of a waxing moon, the loose strand of smoke from a chimney. Each participates in a memory larger than its edge. We have followed these signs from tomb to crypt to hillside, asking them to confess more than they know. And still they have guided us kindly. Now they suggest that we pause before pressing symbols into verdict, that we cool the head and warm the hands and sift instead, because sifting is next. Not denial, not embrace, but the slow practice of sorting. What is marble? What is rumor? What is pollen that traveled on a coat and came honestly to rest? We will take the hive apart gently and see how much honey it truly holds. We will separate petals from brass and hair from legend, and we will do so without breaking the sleep of those who carried these signs before us. Hear the low drum of evening carts. Feel the river settling its shoulders against the banks. Carry the emblems with you as we step into the room where maybe becomes a measured table, papers on the left, pebbles on the right, and a breeze moving slowly across both. The room we enter now is simple. A table, 3 shallow baskets, a window that keeps its promises about light. Outside, wind combs the grass and lets it fall back the way a careful hand smooths hair. Inside, we empty our pockets, the pebbles gathered along the way, the bright bits that ask to be saved, the dust that came uninvited and agree to sort slowly, not to punish wonder, not to crown suspicion, but to see what weight lives where. Call the first basket stone, things that can carry a roof. Into it, we place the king who did not return from the hunt, Dagobert, second of that name, fallen in 679 in a world whose ink was sparse, but not silent. Beside him, we set the long-haired sign of Merovingian sovereignty, more than fashion, less than magic, durable enough to outlast a generation of wars and marriages. We add the quiet coup that learned to use schedules as weapons, the rise of the mayors of the palace, the administrative patience that ended an old house without ending the realm. The shears join this basket too, not as an object, but as an act. Pepin's anointing settles beside them with the calm of oil remembering skin. The year 751 learns to sit where it belongs, in the company of decisions that change texture rather than volume. Stone is not glamorous. It does not glitter when you hold it. It gives what weight gives, a place to stand while you look at the rest. Now the second basket, read. Things that sway yet do not break. Evidence that leans and invites. Artifacts that can be trusted to sing in a certain key, if not to carry a load alone. Saint-Denis belongs here. Its marble certainty about most kings, its elegant shrug about one. The necropolis that teaches dynasties to lie politely side by side and leaves a small gap like a deliberate rest in a score. Stenay lies here as well, the cult of a royal saint, late in form yet sincere in habit, candles whose smoke rose regardless of policy, a bishop's reported vision that sent feet to a grave and hands to prayer. Into reed we set insects of gold recovered from an older tomb, bees to some, cicadas to others, small ovals that let symbols bloom faster than scholarship prefers. Napoleon's embroidery finds this basket too, not as proof of an ancient hive's jurisdiction, but as proof of a later emperor's ear for the kind of antiquity that flatters the present. In Read, we allow ourselves to keep the tune even as we accept that some notes may have been hummed by memory, rather than documented by ledger. Rennes-le-Château's facts lean here as well. A priest who spent more than a parish could explain. Renovations that left color where damp had been. A tower named from scripture that learned to watch horizons. A ledger that behaves until it doesn't. A bishop's letter with air in its margins. A housekeeper who outlived the story long enough to become its last guardian. The Stations of the Cross that persist in behaving slightly out of character. Iconography that invites a second reading without demanding it. The third basket is smoke. Not an insult. Smoke can be beautiful. It shows where heat once lived. It teaches rooms which way air travels. Here we place the Chronicon Sionis, a text with a taste for the dramatic, reported more often than verified, useful perhaps as theater but not as scaffolding. Here too we place the dossiers that arrived with their collars pressed and their manners rehearsed, documents that stitched names into a tapestry whose threads were modern, while its pattern pretended to be antique. They are not worthless, they are clarifying. They taught us how easily desire becomes geometry on a map. Into smoke go the triangles that connect hilltop to tower to chapel with exactness that survives until a new alignment insists on being equally exact. The feast day sunrises that behave wonderfully until one notices how many horizons are generous with lines. The rumor of a chest that held only cloth and names and traveled from port to preceptory as if secrecy weighed nothing. Perhaps such a chest existed, but in this room we let it be fragrance, not furniture. The child who slips south stands for a moment between baskets, as children do when doors entice from opposite sides. We place what we can in Read, a name that recurs in valleys where names learn to change by syllables, a register flourish that feels like a memory misbehaving, a baptismal slab whose letters refuse to die entirely. We allow smoke to keep the part of the tale that wants a prince among olive terraces, married into obscurity, leaving only a hum in family stories, whenever rain persuades people to talk longer after dinner. We do not require stone to bear a boy it never met. Sifting is a kind form of doubt. It invites patience. It keeps the hand from closing too early around a shape that isn't finished choosing its own. At this table we practice a liturgy of maybe. We do not banish wonder, we chaperone it. We do not license credulity, we ask it to share the room with care. Each placement is provisional. A pebble can move later, if new fingers teach it a different balance. The work reveals another truth the mountain was hiding. How much of our love for these stories is not about verdicts at all. It is about continuity that feels earned. Stone reassures the part of us that needs anchor points, dates, names, acts that can be pointed to without apology. Read comforts the part that understands human memory as a marsh, full of birds at dawn, bending, murmuring, never still, yet there each morning. Smoke amuses the part that enjoys pattern for its own sake, and knows that sometimes our eyes arrange the stars into animals because the night would be lonelier otherwise. There is correction in this room, but there is also consolation. Planting papers is a mischief that deserves its footnote and its lamp held close. Yet once the lamp is set down, We notice what the mischief illuminated without intending to. Drawers that had slept, chapels that needed paint, gravestones that wanted brushing, small museums that discovered they could be larger simply by labeling the shelves already in their care. Even a hoax can be a housekeeping tool if the house is willing to learn. We also learn something about symbols when we separate them from claims. Bees survive both baskets because their lesson is not proprietary. They teach by example on summer mornings when no story is required. Fly, return, store, survive, share. Lilies endure because architecture needs punctuation. The world is kinder to corners that end with grace. Hair, whether on a king's head or a saint's, remains a sacrament of mortality, a reminder that power is first a body's patience with time. Not everything can be sorted today. The river outside will carry new silt by morning. Somewhere a document will be found that changes a date's posture by a finger's width, and somewhere else a story will be told as if it were a fact, because the teller required company more than accuracy. Our baskets can tolerate adjustments. They are not courts. They are conversation partners. Sleep comes more easily when the room is in order but not rigid. We pause and look at what we have done. Stone waits without complaint. Reed rustles in a draft that wasn't there a moment ago. Smoke finds the window and leans toward it, as if remembering it has another appointment in someone else's evening. The humility of the scene is its grace. No coronations here, no exposures, only the old household chore of knowing where things belong well enough that you can find them when needed. The last handful to sort is our own. What feelings did we carry up the mountain that have nothing to do with kings or lists or chapels? The desire that lines should meet neatly, the wish that a missing tomb might be an invitation rather than an erasure, the hope that a family could step sideways out of danger and into anonymity without losing its thread. We place these gently where they cannot be knocked to the floor. In reed, perhaps, beside the candles that refuse to be ashamed of burning. When we open the window, the scent that enters is not merely air. It has a thimble of rosemary, a spoon of wax, a suggestion of old paper warmed by sun. The bees outside take advantage of the light as if our sorting had cleared their flight lanes. The river works its patient arithmetic against the banks, rounding what resists and carrying off what never belonged. We close the window again, not to shut out the world, but to keep the room's temper right for one more task. Because another kind of sifting waits. Numbers and names this time. The polite machinery of modern curiosity. If a lineage survived not in marble but in flesh, where would its echoes settle? In surnames that refuse to die in certain valleys. In patterns of kinship that reveal themselves when software learns to draw trees taller than houses. In strands far smaller than hair, patient under microscopes that hum like bees at work. We will carry our baskets to that next table and ask our questions without hurry. Take the stone with us. It steadies the hand. Carry the reed. It will teach the new room to breathe. Let smoke follow if it likes. It often does, and sometimes proves useful by showing where heat remains. Downstairs, the evening has begun its gentle work. We blow the lamp nearly out and leave an ember to find later. The river murmurs like a voice rehearsing a list of names. We step into the corridor where the night air is cooler, and a door ahead opens into light that looks like screens and ledger lines arranged with care. The next room glows a different color, not candlelight, but the tempered gold of screens. On a table lie parish registers turned to air, their ink reborn as pixels that hold handwriting like pressed flowers. A cursor moves with the patience of a careful finger tracing a lineage. A wheel of names turns like a small planet in slow orbit. The hum is not bees this time, but processors, and yet the note is familiar. Industry without trumpet, order made in quiet. Modern genealogy is housekeeping enlarged. Baptisms once trapped in damp cupboards now sit side by side with marriage bonds and burials, each date nested like a cup inside the next. Software takes them in, arranges cousins into lattices, and suggests how branches might have been grafted in storms. Where ink fades, a transcription steps in. Where a page is missing, another parish's duplicate leans over and offers its shoulder. The old river of names, once dark and swift, runs clearer in this glassy channel. Then the science arrives with its particular arithmetic. In test tubes and laboratories, strands finer than hair give up halting pieces of their story. Markers passed father to son along a narrow corridor. Loops of inheritance that travel through mothers. Mixtures in between that remember hundreds of kin at once. Analysts estimate the age of a common ancestor the way millers estimate grain by weight. Not exact, but close enough to bake a decent loaf. The vocabulary charms and warns in equal measure. Limits declare themselves with good manners. Families are more inventive than charts. Children arrive by love rather than paperwork. Adoptions occur. Names are changed to survive a winter or to please a city clerk who liked a different syllable. In some valleys, marriage circled the same hilltop too tightly for generations, and the data echoes back on itself like sound in a small chapel. Elsewhere, a shepherd wandered far, returned with a name like a coin from another country, and the branch refuses to fit the graft we expected. Yet patterns appear, persuasive as constellations once were to navigators. A cluster of surnames, some frank, some softened by dialect, lingers along the old Roman roads where we have been walking all night. Another cluster leans south of the Aude, where towers keep their modest altitudes and rosemary inks the air on warm days. Heat maps color the hills with honeyed hexagons, and one could almost hear a hive in the screen if the room would allow such poetry. Numbers, too, find ways to hum. On the desk rests a small box of printed charts, coaxed from town archives after patient requests. Margins carry penciled notes, a child named for a grandfather, a godparent who appears in 3 households, like a key passed carefully between doors, a priest whose handwriting tightens for 2 winters and then relaxes again. In this archive of breath and intention, the legend we carried begins to test itself against entries that were never trying to be a story, only to be true for the day they were written. You could, if you wished, ask the computers to pronounce verdicts. They will not. They prefer probabilities, kinship coefficients, the language of rain measured in cups. They will say that 2 men share an ancestor within so many centuries, and will draw a ladder between them on the screen like a modest bridge. They will say that a surname in the Ardennes behaves as if it were related to a surname near Carcassonne, but they will not grant a crown to a living head, nor a halo to a grave. They resist romance, and thereby remain useful. Ethics sits in the corner like a chaperone who knows the dance steps better than anyone. Consents must be asked. Results must be kept gentler than pride sometimes prefers. A string of numbers can surprise a household with an old secret, and walls can learn the sound of new silence. It is not wicked to look. It is necessary to look kindly. What we are seeking, after all, is not a museum label to be stuck under a name, but a way for the present to speak with the past without raising its voice. Even so, there is a sweetness when a map and a story find the same door. A surname long thought to be merely handsome turns out to have slept in the records of a monastery near Stenay. A cluster of kin in Languedoc shows a shared marker whose estimated age leans toward the century where our missing heir should have learned to grow olives. The coincidence is not proof. It is a candle set on a windowsill, and the room decides to feel larger while it burns. Elsewhere, the tools do the opposite blessing. They tidy away a wish. A line loudly claiming Merovingian marrow proves instead to be stitched to a later cloth. There is quiet relief in this, oddly enough. To let a false branch be itself is to let the true trunk breathe. Legends are stronger when they shed their borrowed antlers and return to the shape that fits the forest. The data, when it refuses us, performs a kind of mercy. All the while, the symbols we carried behave like good students in a new school. Bees appear in surnames that remember apiaries, and in maps that render modern kinship as honeycomb. Lilies, present in municipal arms and congregation seals, reappear as pins on charts, small petals of color marking baptisms under stained glass windows that still soften noon. Hair, that earlier alphabet of power, survives as a metaphor for strands of code that tangle and untangle in software, a braid of numbers that tells only what it has earned the right to say. Researchers who have worked this ground learn a rhythm like Vespers, a day for documents, a day for DNA, a day for walking the parishes with nothing but a pen and the willingness to ask old people what their grandparents' fields were called. They return with nouns that do not live on screens, the name of a stream no map writes, the nickname of a family now 2 counties removed, and those nouns slip into databases with a pleasing friction, as if language itself desired to be neighborly with numbers. What rises from this patient labor is not a pedigree that forces knees to bend, but a living map, the sort hung in kitchens where children learn rivers by lip, not by legend. On it, roots of marriage look like threads a grandmother would approve. Clusters of cousins reveal themselves as weather, common in certain seasons, rare in others. The missing tomb in Paris matters less here than the steady attendance of names at christenings, the way candles continued to sign their light even when history ran short on ink. Can science test a legend without unmaking it? The room answers by example. Data sifts, lore breathes, both remain. What it tends to unmake are the impolite parts, the presumption that stories must kneel to numbers or numbers to stories. Instead, they share a bench. The legend becomes humbler and, in a way, more durable, a companion for walking rather than a banner for marching. You can sleep beside a companion. Banners demand postures that ache. There are houses still in the South where certain names resist extinction against the odds. A few haplotypes refuse to wander far from old Roman roads even when jobs ask them to. Whether or not royalty ever drank morning milk there, dignity did and does. The dignity of people who marry, bury, harvest, move, and return. Continuity, that modest miracle, rarely writes to newspapers. It leaves its letters in parish books and the shy mathematics of cousins. Toward evening, the last light catches the screen at an angle that turns pixels into a dim comb. Cells glow and fade as if bees were moving behind the glass. Outside, wind smooths the fields, the way a hand smooths cloth before it is folded. Names rest on the table, sorted for now, ready to be changed tomorrow by a document found behind a drawer or a cousin who decides to spit into a tube. We thank the machines for their candor and the archives for their patience and gather our papers without hurry. On the way out, we pass a mirror and catch a glimpse of hair caught briefly by the same draft that lifts the corner of a chart. The old symbol and the new join for an instant and let the room feel quietly complete. In the street, lamps lift their halos. A few windows show the warmth of dinners that explain the day to those who need no proofs. The river is sounding unambitious and thus eternal. We follow it back towards sleep. Ahead waits no verdict, only the good ending that history affords when voices have been respectful. We will close the doors softly. Let the bees fold into their combs. Let lilies become corners in dim rooms. Let strands lie at rest. The map will keep breathing in the dark. A chest rising and falling. Step softly now. The last turn is before us, a corridor washed in low light where questions learn, finally, to be quiet and to love the hush that answers them. Evening draws its thumb across the hinge of the world, and doors remember how to close without complaint. Lamps lower their gold to the softness of butter left out for morning toast. Windows give back their reflections and keep nothing for themselves. In gardens and courts, the last wings find their rooms. The hill, the road, the river settle into the same slow breath. We set our stones down where we found them. A king who did not return. A dynasty that wore its sign like weather. A steward who learned to move calendars as if they were rivers. The forest of Arden keeps its hush. The Roman road keeps its line beneath grass that pretends not to remember. What needed telling has been told gently. What needed leaving has been left in peace. Saint-Denis holds its patient marble. Stenay keeps its smaller flame. A closed corridor stays kindly closed for reasons everyone understands. In the crypt, the hum that once suggested bees thins into the cool that stone prefers. If there is a chamber, it can sleep. If there is only story, it can sleep as well. Rest here is not verdict, but courtesy. Papers return to their shelves like geese to water. Maps fold as neatly as handkerchiefs, and do not mind if triangles turn back into ordinary hills. In the tower above the Aude, the pictures resume their parish duties, whispering less and blessing more. Keys that once rang for nights lie quiet in drawers that know their weight by heart. Roads will wake tomorrow and be roads again. People do the same. Bread cools, names are spoken softly to children half asleep. A palm pauses on a lintel where a small lily keeps the corner from feeling alone. In the field, bees knit night to night with a thread too fine for worry. Hair lifts once in the breeze and lies down, as laws older than metal intended. Bells consider a last note and decide against it. Mist practices dawn. So we lay down the sword, that was mostly symbol, and watch the scabbard accept it. Candles find their embers. Smoke writes one last thin line and is gone. The river slips past stone with the discretion of a good story, leaving by the garden gate. Stars dim by degrees, never in haste. The hum we have carried becomes breath, then becomes sleep. Doors close all the way, and the house of history rests.